Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The cold metal of the pier bit through my boots as the clock struck 11. November in this harbor meant temperatures that could freeze the salt spray before it hit the ground, and the wind coming off the water carried that particular bite that made your bones ache. My name is Rylan Hardacre. I've worked port police for 12 years now, and the silence of the night shift still gets under my skin. Elias Truitt met me outside the main security building that night. He was the dock supervisor on duty, a tall man with shoulders that seemed permanently hunched forward, like the weight of years had settled there and refused to leave. He had the standard logbook tucked under one arm and a half-empty coffee cup in the other. "Quiet night ahead, I figure," he said, but his tone didn't convince me. Quiet nights at this port were rare. We headed into the watchroom where Juno Merrick was already stationed. She had her eyes locked on the security monitors, fingers drumming a rhythm on the edge of the desk like she was keeping time to some song only she could hear. Juno was young for a security tech, but she took her work seriously. "Not much movement tonight," she said without turning around. "Just that container ship at D17. They're scheduled to start loading at first light." I poured myself coffee while the sound of seagulls crying outside filtered through the window. Through the glass I could see the harbor lights, yellow and white beams cutting through the foggy air, trying to pierce the mist that rolled in from the ocean. The massive cranes cast shadows across the iron piers, and the wind made the mooring lines groan and creak. Security flags snapped in the breeze, their fabric making sharp cracks in the darkness. The taste of burnt coffee filled my mouth as I took the first sip. Elias set the logbook down on the table between us and flipped it open to tonight's entries. His handwriting was neat, almost meticulous, each line carefully documented with times and locations. "Cargo manifest came through around 6, he said, running his finger down the page. 42 containers currently in the yard, all accounted for and sealed. Juno finally turned away from her monitors. "Camera 12 has been acting up again," she mentioned. "Gets these weird interference lines every 20 minutes or so. Tech said they'd fix it last week, but you know how that goes." She pulled up the camera feed on the main screen. It showed the eastern section of the container yard, rows of steel boxes stacked 3 high, their identification numbers barely visible in the floodlight glow. The radio on my belt crackled with static. I adjusted the volume and heard the harbor patrol boat checking in from their position near the breakwater. Their voices sounded tinny and distant through the speaker. Everything seemed routine, just another November night at the port. But there was something in the air that bothered me. Maybe it was the way the fog seemed thicker than usual, or how the wind had this hollow sound when it moved between the containers. I'd learned to trust my instincts over the years. That feeling in your gut when something wasn't quite right even if you couldn't put your finger on what it was. Elias noticed me staring out the window. "Something on your mind?" he asked. I shook my head and turned back to the monitors. "Just the usual pre-shift nerves," I lied. He nodded like he understood, but I caught him glancing at the fog-shrouded yard with an expression that mirrored my own unease. The next hour passed in relative silence. Juno cycled through the camera feeds while I walked the perimeter of the main building, checking locks and making notes in my own log. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the concrete, mixing with the distant clang of chains from the moored ships. Somewhere in the darkness, a foghorn sounded, low and mournful. When I returned to the watchroom, Juno was leaning closer to one of her screens. "That's weird," she muttered. Elias and I both moved to look over her shoulder. She was reviewing footage from camera 8, which covered the D-17 section where the container ship was docked. "Look at this timestamp," she said, pointing. The footage showed containers stacked in their designated positions. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but Juno rewound the feed and played it again, this time in slow motion. For just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless you were really paying attention, one of the containers appeared to shift. Not much, maybe an inch or two, but definitely movement where there shouldn't be any. Elias frowned and reached for the logbook again. He flipped back through several pages, checking something. "What's the container number?" he asked. Juno zoomed in on the feed until the identification number became clear. TCLU 44273889. Elias's frown deepened. "That's not right," he said quietly. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that came when routine started turning into something else. "What's not right?" I asked. Elias showed me the logbook entry from earlier in the evening. The container in question was listed as TCLU 44273889, same as what we saw on the screen. But there was a second entry, made about an hour later in different handwriting, listing the same position with a different number, TCLU 44273898. The difference was minimal, just one digit changed. It could have been a clerical error, someone misreading their own writing or transposing numbers when they copied information from one form to another. But Elias ran a tight ship when it came to documentation. He didn't make mistakes like that. Juno pulled up the current live feed from camera 8. The container sat in the exact same position, still showing the number 44273889 on its side. "When was that second entry made?" I asked. Elias checked the timestamp. "About 2200 hours, he said. That was roughly an hour before my shift started. I grabbed my flashlight and radio. "I'm going to walk out there and take a look," I said. Elias started to protest, mentioning something about protocol and waiting until morning, but I was already heading for the door. Juno called after me, saying she'd keep the camera trained on my position. The cold hit me like a wall when I stepped outside. The fog had gotten thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction. My flashlight beam didn't penetrate very far into that gray soup. The sound of water lapping against the pier piling seemed louder than it should be, and somewhere nearby I could hear the rhythmic creaking of a ship's hull as it rose and fell with the gentle swell. I made my way toward the D-17 section, following the painted lines on the concrete that marked the pathways between container stacks. The floodlights created these strange halos in the fog, circles of diffused yellow light that made everything look dreamlike and slightly unreal. My breath came out in white puffs that hung in the air for a moment before the wind tore them away. The containers loomed out of the fog like massive building blocks, their corrugated metal sides slick with condensation. I could hear my footsteps echoing back at me from the steel surfaces, creating this disorienting effect where it sounded like someone was walking parallel to me just out of sight. I stopped several times to listen, but there was never anything there. When I reached the container in question, I played my flashlight over its surface. The number TCLU 44273889 was clearly visible, painted in white letters about 3 feet high. The seal on the door was intact, a numbered metal tag that showed no signs of tampering. I pulled out my notepad and wrote down the seal number, then checked it against the manifest sheet I'd grabbed from the office. Everything matched. The container was exactly where it was supposed to be, sealed exactly as it should be. But that didn't explain the discrepancy in the logbook, or that brief moment on the camera where it seemed to move. I walked around the container, checking the ground around it for any signs of disturbance. The concrete was damp from the fog, but there were no unusual marks. No drag lines or scuff marks that would indicate the container had been moved. The corner castings that locked it to the containers below were secure and properly engaged. My radio crackled. "Hardacre, you getting anything out there?" It was Juno's voice, slightly distorted by static. I keyed the mic. "Negative, everything looks normal. Containers sealed and in position." There was a pause before she responded. "Copy that. You should know. Camera 12 just went out completely. I'm getting nothing but snow." That was the camera she'd mentioned earlier, the one that had been having problems. Still, the timing felt off somehow. I was about to head back when I noticed something on the ground near the front corner of the container. It was small, easy to miss in the fog and darkness. I crouched down to get a better look. It was a piece of paper, damp and starting to disintegrate from the moisture. I picked it up carefully and saw what looked like part of a shipping label, the kind that gets attached to manifests. The ink had run, but I could make out partial numbers, 427398, the second number from the logbook. I stood up slowly, feeling that prickling sensation on the back of my neck that usually meant trouble. The fog seemed to press in closer around me, and for a moment I had the distinct impression that I wasn't alone in this section of the yard. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, but saw nothing except more containers and more fog. "Juno, I'm heading back," I said into the radio. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. The walk back to the security building felt longer than it should have, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from between those stacks of metal boxes. When I finally reached the building and stepped back inside, the warmth felt like a physical relief. Elias was still at the table with the logbook when I came in. I showed him the piece of paper I'd found and watched his expression darken. "That's not good," he said quietly. Juno had abandoned her monitors and was standing next to us now, looking at the fragment of label. "What does it mean?" she asked. Elias rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion and worry. "It means someone changed the documentation," he said, "either in the system or in the book itself. And they were sloppy about it, left evidence behind." He looked at me. "Did you see anyone out there?" I shook my head. Nothing. Place was empty. But even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure that was true. There had been that moment near the container when I felt like I wasn't alone. Just a feeling, nothing concrete, nothing I could put in a report. The next few hours passed slowly. Juno worked on getting camera 12 back online while Elias went through every entry in the logbook with a fine-toothed comb, looking for other discrepancies. I monitored the radio and kept an eye on the remaining camera feeds, watching the fog slowly thin as the night wore on. Around 3 in the morning, Elias found something else. Another container, different section of the yard, same kind of alteration in the logbook. The original entry had been partially erased and written over with a different container number. "This is systematic," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Someone's been messing with our records." I thought about security protocols, about who had access to the logbook and when. During the day shift, there were dozens of people in and out of this office. Crane operators, truck drivers, customs officials, dock workers. Anyone could have grabbed the book for a few seconds and made changes. But why would they? Juno finally got camera 12 working again around 4. The first thing we saw when the feed came back was that same section of the yard I'd walked through earlier. Everything looked normal in the pre-dawn darkness. The containers sat in their neat rows, exactly where they were supposed to be. But then Juno rewound the footage to see what we'd missed while the camera was down. What we saw made my blood run cold. The timestamp showed approximately 2:15 in the morning, maybe half an hour after I'd returned from my inspection. On the screen, the container TCLU 442738 was clearly visible in its position. Then, for just a single frame, maybe a tenth of a second, the image flickered. When it cleared, the container's door was open. Not all the way, just a crack, maybe 6 inches. The seal that I had personally verified as intact was dangling loose. We could see darkness inside the container, a black void that the camera's night vision couldn't penetrate. The next frame showed the door closed again, seal back in place, everything normal. It happened so fast that if we hadn't been reviewing the footage in slow motion, we would have missed it entirely. Juno played it back 3 more times to make sure we weren't seeing things. We weren't. Elias picked up the phone to call the harbor master. His hand was shaking slightly as he dialed. I couldn't blame him. In 12 years of working this port, I'd never seen anything like what we were looking at on that screen. The laws of physics didn't allow for containers to open and close themselves in the blink of an eye. While Elias talked on the phone, keeping his voice low and measured, I watched Juno cycle through the other camera feeds. Most showed exactly what you'd expect. Empty yards, parked equipment, the occasional security light creating pools of illumination in the darkness. But camera 8, the one covering D-17, showed something that made me lean in closer. The container was still in position, but there was something on the ground in front of it now, something that definitely hadn't been there when I'd inspected the area earlier. It looked like a puddle of some kind, dark and liquid, reflecting the floodlights above. "Juno, can you zoom in on that?" I asked, pointing to the screen. She manipulated the controls, bringing the image closer. The puddle was roughly circular, maybe 3 feet across, spreading out from directly beneath the container's door. It could have been water, condensation dripping from the metal, but there was something about the way it sat on the concrete, the way the light reflected off its surface, that didn't look quite right. Elias hung up the phone. "Harbor master's coming in early," he said. "Wants a full inspection of that container at first light." He looked at the screen, at the mysterious puddle we were all now staring at. "And he's calling in customs. If someone's been tampering with seals and documentation, this could be a smuggling situation." The radio on my belt crackled to life. It was the harbor patrol boat, the same one that had checked in at the start of my shift. But now the voice coming through the speaker sounded strained, uncertain. Security building, this is Harbor Patrol. We're getting some weird readings on our instruments out here. Compass is spinning. GPS is showing our position is about 3 miles off from where we actually are." I grabbed the radio. "Harbor Patrol, this is Hardacre. Are you experiencing any mechanical issues? Over." The response took a few seconds to come back, and when it did, there was heavy static in the background. "Negative on mechanical issues. Everything was fine until about 5 minutes ago. Then all our electronics started going haywire. We're returning to dock." Juno had pulled up the maritime tracking system on one of her computers. The harbor patrol boat's transponder signal was showing exactly what they'd described. A position reading that put them miles offshore when they were actually just past the breakwater. As we watched, the signal jumped around erratically, appearing in different locations on the map before finally stabilizing near the main pier. The fog was starting to lift as dawn approached. Through the window, I could see the sky beginning to lighten in the east, that deep blue-black of night slowly giving way to the gray of early morning. The floodlights in the yard seemed less necessary now, their yellow glow fading into the growing natural light. Elias made the decision to conduct another physical inspection before the harbor master arrived. This time, all 3 of us went, walking together through the container yard as the sun slowly rose behind us. The puddle we'd seen on camera was still there, but in person it looked even stranger than it had on the screen. It wasn't water. The consistency was wrong, thicker somehow, and it had this faint iridescent sheen to it like motor oil. But it didn't smell like oil. It didn't really smell like anything, which was almost more disturbing than if it had reeked. Juno took out her phone and snapped several photos while I used a pen to prod at the edge of the puddle. The liquid moved sluggishly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to be disturbed. When I lifted the pen, a thin strand of the stuff clung to it for a moment before breaking. Elias was examining the container seal again, and I heard him make a small sound of surprise. "Look at this," he said. The seal was intact, number matching what was in the records. But there were marks on it now that I was certain hadn't been there during my midnight inspection. They looked almost like scratches, thin, parallel lines scored into the metal. They could have been from handling, from the seal being roughly installed. But there were 3 lines perfectly parallel, each exactly the same depth. They looked deliberate. We were about to head back to the security building when I heard it. A sound from inside the container, muffled and distant but unmistakable. It was a metallic scraping, like something being dragged across a steel floor. All 3 of us froze, looking at each other with expressions that probably mirrored my own confusion and growing dread. Elias put his ear against the container's door. We stood there in silence, barely breathing, listening. The sound came again, clearer this time. Scrape, pause, scrape. Rhythmic, deliberate, like something heavy being moved in short increments. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. "There's something in there," Juno whispered. Her face had gone pale in the dawn light. Elias checked his watch. "Harbor Master will be here in about 20 minutes, he said. "We wait for him before we open it. Whatever's in there can wait that long." But I wasn't so sure about that. The scraping sound had felt intentional, almost like it was meant for us to hear. Like whatever was inside that container knew we were standing right outside, and it wanted us to know it was there. The thought made my skin crawl. We returned to the security building to wait. Juno immediately pulled up the camera feeds again, focusing on container TCLU 4427389. It sat there innocently in the growing daylight, giving no indication of the strangeness we'd witnessed over the past several hours. The puddle in front of it had already started to dry, leaving behind a dark stain on the concrete. The harbor master arrived at 6:30, pulling up in his truck with 2 customs officials in tow. Elias briefed them on what we'd found while I pulled together all the documentation. The logbook entries, the camera footage, photos of the puddle, and the scratched seal. When they saw the video of the container door opening and closing in that single frame, both customs officials exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. We all walked out to D17 together as the sun finally cleared the horizon. The morning shift was starting to arrive. Crane operators and dock workers beginning their day. None of them knew what we were about to do, what we might find inside that container. The harbor master had brought bolt cutters for the seal. He positioned himself in front of the container door while one of the customs officials recorded everything on a body camera. The other official stood off to one side with a checklist and manifest. Elias, Juno, and I formed a small semicircle behind them, watching as the harbor master reached for the seal. The sound of the bolt cutters biting through metal seemed unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. The seal fell away, and the harbor master grabbed the door handle. "Everyone ready?" he asked. We nodded. He pulled the handle and swung the door open. The smell hit us first. Not rot, not decay, nothing organic. It smelled like ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, sharp and electric. The interior of the container was dark despite the morning sun, shadows seeming to cling to the corners in defiance of the light trying to penetrate inside. The customs official with the body camera aimed a flashlight into the container. We could see boxes inside, neatly stacked and secured, exactly as they should be according to the manifest. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked out of place. The official stepped inside, his footsteps echoing on the metal floor. He checked the first few boxes, comparing numbers on their labels to his manifest. Everything matched. He moved deeper into the container and we lost sight of him for a moment as he disappeared behind a stack of crates. "All appears normal," his voice called back to us. "Contents match the documentation." But then he stopped talking. We waited for him to continue his inspection, to say something else, but silence stretched out. The harbor master called into the container. "Everything all right in there?" No response. He called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The second customs official started forward, but the first one suddenly reappeared from behind the crates. His face was pale, and there was sweat on his forehead despite the cold morning air. "We need to seal this back up," he said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain underneath it. "Right now." The harbor master started to argue, but the official cut him off. "I said we need to seal this container immediately, and it needs to be moved off the dock as soon as possible. I'll file the paperwork when we get back to the office." He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes as he climbed out of the container and moved away from it quickly. Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't up for discussion. The harbor master looked confused, but he ordered everyone to back away from the container. A new seal was brought, installed, and documented. The whole time, the customs official who'd been inside stood apart from us, staring at the container with an expression I couldn't quite identify. When the paperwork was done and the harbor master's truck had driven away, Elias pulled me aside. "Did you see his hands?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "They were shaking," Elias said. "Whatever he saw in there scared him badly enough that he's not even willing to talk about it." The rest of the day passed in a blur of reports and phone calls. The container was scheduled to be loaded onto the ship that evening and moved out with the tide. Camera 12 developed interference problems again right around noon and stayed down for almost an hour. When it came back online, Juno noticed something that made her call me over to look. The container had moved. Not much, maybe 3 or 4 feet from its original position. But it had definitely shifted. No cranes had been operating in that section of the yard. No equipment had been near it. Yet there it sat, subtly out of alignment with the others around it, like something had pushed it from the inside. We checked the cameras from every angle, reviewed all the footage from the hour camera 12 had been down. Nothing showed how or when the container had moved. It was simply in one position when the camera went dark and in a different position when it came back online. Elias checked the logbook one final time before the end of our extended shift. The entry for TCLU 4427389 now showed a third variation in the container number, this one in handwriting that none of us recognized. The entry had been made sometime in the last hour, but no one remembered seeing anyone at the logbook. That evening, I watched from the security building as a crane lifted the container onto the ship. The operation went smoothly. No problems, no delays. The ship's manifest was updated and signed. By 8 p.m., the vessel had departed the harbor, taking container TCLU 4427389 with it. I should have felt relieved to see it go. Instead, I felt unsettled, like we'd just passed something dangerous along to someone else without warning them. Juno had gone home hours earlier, too exhausted to stay for the loading. Elias stood next to me at the window, both of us watching the ship's lights fade into the distance. "What do you think was in there?" I asked him. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I don't think I want to know," he finally said. "Whatever it was, it's someone else's problem now." He picked up the logbook and walked it over to the filing cabinet where the old logs were stored. That night, I went home, but couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that single frame of video, the container door standing open for a fraction of a second. I thought about the puddle that wasn't quite liquid, about the scratches on the seal, about the scraping sound from inside. Most of all, I thought about the look on that customs official's face when he came back out. The next morning, I was told not to report for duty. Internal Affairs wanted to interview everyone who'd been present during the container incident. Apparently, the customs official had filed some kind of report that raised red flags with the department. They wanted our statements, wanted to review all the documentation, wanted to understand exactly what had happened. I gave my statement 3 times to 3 different people. Each time they focused on different details, asked the same questions in different ways. They seemed particularly interested in the video footage, in the discrepancies in the logbook, and why we hadn't immediately reported the irregularities to higher authorities. I answered as honestly as I could, but I could tell they thought we were holding something back. Maybe we were. Maybe there were details that seemed too strange to include in an official report, things that would make us sound unreliable or unstable. Like the way the fog had felt almost alive that night, pressing in around us with purpose, or how the container seemed to radiate cold, even though thermometers showed ambient temperature. Small things, subtle things, things that added up to a feeling rather than facts. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. In the end, they concluded that there had been documentation errors, possibly due to fatigue, possibly due to computer glitches in the manifest system. The video footage was deemed corrupted, the single frame showing the open door classified as a technical artifact. The puddle was attributed to condensation or leaked coolant from nearby equipment. Everything had a rational explanation, neatly filed and categorized. But they never explained what the customs official saw inside that container. His report was classified, sealed under some regulation I'd never heard of. He transferred to a different office shortly after, and the one time I tried to reach out to him, he refused to talk about it. Whatever he'd seen in there was something he wanted to forget. I kept working at the port, kept pulling night shifts, kept watching the cameras and walking the yards. But I developed new habits. I started checking seal numbers twice, documenting everything with photos, maintaining my own private log separate from the official one. Juno did the same. So did Elias. Because sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in and the wind makes the mooring line sing, we still see things on the cameras that don't quite make sense. Containers that shift position when no one's looking. Shadows that move independently of any light source. Sounds coming from sealed cargo that shouldn't be able to make any sound at all. We document it all, carefully and thoroughly. We file our reports and follow protocol. But we also know that some things don't have rational explanations, no matter how much the official reports might claim otherwise. Some things exist in the spaces between what we can see and what we can prove, in that gray area where the strange becomes the unexplainable. 3 days after the container incident, I was back on regular rotation. The department had cleared me of any wrongdoing, though I could tell from the way my supervisor avoided eye contact that there were still questions he wasn't comfortable asking. Juno returned to her post the same night I did, and we fell back into the familiar rhythm of the night shift like nothing had happened. But things had changed. Elias was different now, quieter than usual, spending long stretches of time just staring at the logbook like it might reveal secrets if he looked hard enough. Juno jumped at small sounds, her hand constantly hovering near the camera controls, ready to rewind and review anything that seemed even slightly out of place. And I found myself checking over my shoulder more often, that feeling of being watched now a constant companion during my rounds. The first indication that our troubles weren't over came 4 nights after my return. I was doing a routine patrol of the northern container yard when my radio picked up something strange. It wasn't one of our regular channels, wasn't any frequency that should have been accessible on port police equipment. Just static at first, then underneath it, barely audible, what sounded like breathing. I stopped walking and listened more carefully. The breathing had a rhythm to it, slow and deliberate, like someone in deep sleep or deep meditation. I checked the radio display, but it showed no active channel, no transmission source, just that steady pattern of inhalation and exhalation coming through the speaker. Then it cut off abruptly mid-breath, leaving only silence. When I got back to the security building, I mentioned it to Juno. She pulled up the radio logs for that time period and found nothing. According to the system, no transmissions had occurred on any frequency within range. Maybe interference from one of the ships, she suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. Elias had been going through the old logbooks, pulling records from weeks and months past. I found him at 2 a.m, surrounded by open books, making notes on a legal pad in his careful handwriting. "Found something interesting," he said without looking up. "This isn't the first time we've had documentation discrepancies." He showed me entries dating back almost 6 months. Every 4 to 6 weeks there would be a container that showed number variations in the log, subtle changes that could be dismissed as clerical errors. But looking at them all together, laid out in chronological order, a pattern emerged. The same kinds of alterations, the same careful scratching out of one digit and replacement with another. "How did no one notice this before?" I asked. Elias shrugged. "Because we weren't looking for it. Each incident was handled individually, explained away, forgotten, but put them all together." He trailed off, gesturing at the notebooks. "Put them all together, and it looked like something systematic, something intentional." I started helping him document the pattern. We created a timeline, marking each incident, noting which section of the yard it occurred in, which shift was on duty. What we found was disturbing in its consistency. Every incident happened during the night shift. Every container in question was in the same general area of the port, the D section where TCLU 4427389 had been located, and every single one occurred during periods when Camera 12 was experiencing technical difficulties. "Someone's been using that camera's dead spots," I said. Elias nodded grimly. "Question is, who? And what are they doing that requires the cameras to be down?" We both knew the obvious answer was smuggling, but that didn't explain the other elements. The puddles that weren't quite liquid, the sounds from inside sealed containers, the way electronics went haywire in the vicinity. Juno called us over to her monitors around 3:30. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tight. She had pulled up archived footage from one of the previous incidents, a container that had shown documentation irregularities about 2 months earlier. The timestamp showed 2:15 in the morning, almost exactly the same time as when TCLU 4427389's door had appeared open on camera. She played the footage. Like before, there was a single frame of anomaly, but this time, instead of an open door, the image showed something else. The container was still sealed, still in its proper position. But on the ground in front of it, clearly visible even in the low resolution of the security camera, were footprints. They led from the container's door out into the open space of the yard, then stopped abruptly after about 10 feet. There was no sign of whoever or whatever had made them in the frames before or after. They simply appeared in that one moment of video, then were gone. Juno zoomed in on the prints. They were barefoot, human-sized, and they appeared wet, leaving dark impressions on the concrete. "Same MO as our incident," Elias said. "Single frame of impossible footage, evidence that shouldn't exist, then nothing." He pulled out his timeline and marked this new information. "If this pattern holds, we're due for another incident within the next week or two." The thought sat uneasily with all of us. Whatever was happening at this port, it was ongoing, cyclical. And now that we knew what to look for, We couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. We made a decision that night, unofficial and unspoken at first, then formalized with a handshake. We would document everything, keep our own records separate from the official logs, and try to be ready for whatever came next. The following nights passed without incident, but the tension never left. We started taking extra cameras from storage, setting up our own surveillance system focused specifically on the D section. Elias modified the logbook procedure, requiring photo documentation of every seal number at the start and end of each shift. Juno installed software that would alert us immediately if camera 12 went down for any reason. On the 6th night after our decision to actively investigate, we got our first hit. At exactly 2:13 in the morning, camera 12's feed cut to static. Juno's alert system started shrieking, and all three of us converged on her station. The camera had gone down, and according to the diagnostic data, it wasn't a technical malfunction. Something was actively jamming the signal. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed for the door. Elias tried to stop me, citing safety protocols and the need to call for backup, but I was already moving. Whatever was about to happen in D section, I wanted to see it with my own eyes this time. I heard him cursing behind me as he grabbed his own equipment to follow. The run to D section took about 3 minutes. The fog was thick again tonight, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears, my boots pounding on the pavement, the distant sound of water against the pier pilings. When I reached the container yard, I slowed down, trying to move more quietly. The section was dark, the floodlights creating only small islands of illumination in the dense fog. I could see containers looming out of the mist like sleeping giants. My flashlight beam didn't penetrate far, reflecting back off the water droplets suspended in the air. I keyed my radio. "Juno, which container?" I whispered. Her voice came back distorted by static. "Can't, clearly, camera down, D17 vicinity." The signal degraded into noise. I was on my own. I moved between the container stacks, checking the identification numbers, trying to orient myself. The fog played tricks with sound, making it seem like footsteps were coming from every direction at once. Then I heard it. That scraping sound, metal on metal, coming from somewhere ahead of me. I killed my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the darkness, moving forward slowly. The scraping came again, closer now, rhythmic and purposeful. Scrape, pause, scrape. I rounded a stack of containers and froze. There, in front of me, was a container with its door standing wide open. The seal lay on the ground, cut cleanly through. But there was no one around, no equipment, no sign of how the seal had been breached. The container's interior was pitch black, a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb what little light there was. The scraping sound came again, and this time I could tell it was coming from inside the container. Something was moving in there, shifting around in the dark. My hand went to my radio automatically, but I hesitated. What would I report? That I'd found an open container with something inside making noise? Without witnesses, without evidence, it would sound insane. I was still trying to decide what to do when I heard Elias calling my name. He emerged from the fog a moment later, breathing hard from running. He saw the open container, and his eyes went wide. "Jesus," he muttered. "Is there someone inside?" Before I could answer, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed felt worse somehow, pregnant with expectation. We stood there in the fog and darkness, staring at that open container, waiting for something to happen. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then we heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the container. They were moving toward the opening, toward us. I reached for my sidearm, thumbing off the safety. Elias had his flashlight up. The beam pointed at the container entrance, but not turned on yet, his thumb hovering over the switch. The footsteps reached the opening. We could hear breathing now, shallow and raspy. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the blackness behind it. It was human-shaped, roughly the right size and proportions, but something about the way it moved wasn't quite right. The joints seemed to bend at wrong angles, and it had this jerky, stuttering motion like a film skipping frames. Elias hit his flashlight. The beam caught the figure full on, and what I saw in that moment burned itself into my memory. It was a man, or had been. His skin was gray and slick with something that could have been water but looked thicker. His eyes were open but clouded over, unseeing. He was barefoot, and his feet left wet prints on the metal floor of the container. But the worst part was his mouth. It was moving, opening and closing like he was trying to speak. No sound came out except for a faint whistling, like air escaping from a puncture. His tongue was black and swollen, and there was something wrong with his throat, a depression or hollow where it should have been solid. The figure took a step toward us, and I raised my weapon. "Police, don't move!" My voice came out steadier than I felt. The figure stopped but continued that unsettling mouth movement, trying to form words it couldn't speak. Then it raised one hand, pointing past us into the fog. I risked a glance in the direction it was pointing. There was nothing there that I could see, just more fog and darkness. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Not retreated back into the container, not moved to either side. Simply gone, like it had never been there. The wet footprints it had left were already evaporating, fading into nothing. Elias and I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Then we both moved at once, me to the container to check inside, him to the radio to try raising Juno. The container was empty, completely empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of cargo. The manifest had listed it as carrying electronics components, but there was nothing inside. Just bare metal walls and that strange smell, like ozone and salt water. Juno's voice crackled through Elias's radio. "Back online. What's your status?" Elias reported what we'd found, his voice carefully neutral, sticking to facts. Open container, seal cut, no cargo inside, no suspects in the vicinity. He didn't mention the figure we'd seen. Neither did I when I made my own report a few minutes later. We stayed with the container until day shift arrived. As the sun came up and the fog began to lift, the whole incident started to feel unreal, like a shared hallucination. But the cut seal was real, lying on the ground where we'd found it. The empty container was real, its absence of cargo undeniable. And when we checked the manifest, we found the same kind of alteration in the container number that had plagued the previous incidents. The customs officials who responded were different ones from before. They inspected the empty container, documented the missing cargo, and initiated a theft investigation. They seemed satisfied with the explanation that someone had stolen the contents overnight, using the fog as cover. The cut seal supported that theory, as did the lack of any other evidence. But Elias pulled me aside before the officials left. "The serial number on that seal," he said quietly. "I checked it against our records. It wasn't on any active shipment. That seal was from a container that was logged as shipped out 6 weeks ago." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "You're saying that seal shouldn't have even been in our inventory anymore?" He nodded. "It should be halfway to Shanghai by now on whatever ship it was loaded onto. But instead it's here, on a container that might not even be the one it was originally assigned to." He showed me his notebook where he'd been tracking seal numbers. "I'm starting to think the containers themselves aren't what they appear to be." Over the next week, we dug deeper. Juno pulled every piece of camera footage she could find relating to the D-section containers. Elias went through years of logbooks, looking for patterns. I started interviewing dock workers, crane operators, anyone who had regular contact with that section of the port. What we found painted a disturbing picture. The D section had a reputation, not officially, not anything that made it into reports or safety briefings. But talk to the workers who'd been around for more than a few years, and they all had stories. Containers that felt wrong somehow, that made the hair on your neck stand up when you got close to them. Equipment that malfunctioned only in that specific area. Sounds at night that couldn't be explained. One crane operator, a guy named Marcus who'd worked the port for 15 years, told me about a night 5 years ago when he'd been moving containers in D section during overtime. He'd hooked one particular container and started to lift it when his crane's hydraulics suddenly failed. The container dropped about 3 feet before the emergency brakes caught it. "That's not the weird part," Marcus said. "The weird part was what happened after. I climbed down to check the damage, make sure the container hadn't split. When I got close to it, I could hear something inside. Not cargo shifting, not anything like that. It sounded like breathing. Deep, slow breathing, like something big was asleep in there." He'd reported it to his supervisor who'd checked the seal and the manifest. Everything was in order. The container was supposed to contain machine parts, metal components that definitely shouldn't be breathing. But his supervisor heard it too, though he never admitted it officially. They ended up loading that container onto a ship that same night, and both of them tried to forget about it. "But here's the thing," Marcus continued. "About a month later, I was working the same section, and I swear I saw that same container again. Same number, same company markings. But that's impossible, right? I watched it leave on that ship. I saw it sail out of the harbor." He shook his head. "I started requesting assignments in other sections after that." I compiled all these stories, all these accounts of strangeness in D section and brought them to Elias. He'd made his own discovery in the old logbooks. The documentation irregularities, the number changes, they went back further than we'd thought. He'd found references in logs from 20 years ago, brief notes about clerical errors and database glitches that followed the exact same pattern we were seeing now. "This has been happening for decades," he said. "Whatever this is, it's not new. It's just that no one's ever put all the pieces together before because each incident gets handled individually, written off as isolated events." He showed me a memo from 1998 about implementing new SEAL protocols to prevent documentation errors in D section. Another from 2003 about upgrading cameras to address persistent technical issues in the D-17 area. The port had been trying to solve this problem for years, but they'd been treating the symptoms instead of investigating the cause. Because how do you investigate something like this? How do you file a report saying that containers seem to have some kind of existence independent of their physical location? That seals from shipped cargo appear on containers that should be thousands of miles away? Juno found something in the archived camera footage that made the situation even stranger. She'd been going through old recordings, looking at those single frames of anomaly we'd identified. She noticed that in each case, the timestamp was identical. 2:15 a.m. Not approximately 2:15, but exactly 2:15 Hunkwuk, down to the second. "It's like whatever's happening is on a schedule," she said. "And it's precise enough that it hits the same second every time it occurs." She'd created a spreadsheet tracking every known incident, and the pattern was undeniable. Every 4 to 6 weeks at exactly 2:15 a.m., something happened in D section. A container would show anomalous behavior, documentation would be altered, and camera 12 would malfunction. We were 1 week away from the next projected incident according to Juno's timeline. This time, we were determined to be ready. We set up additional cameras, got permission to run extended patrols in D section during the critical time window, and coordinated our schedules so all three of us would be on duty that night. But the universe, or whatever force was at work in our port, had other plans. 3 days before the projected date, at 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Camera 12 went down. We hadn't been expecting it, hadn't prepared. I was in the middle of a patrol on the opposite side of the port when it happened. By the time I got to D section, it was over. A container stood open, empty of cargo it was supposed to contain. The seal was cut, lying on the ground. But this time there was something else, something new. Inside the container, written on the metal wall in what looked like frost or condensation, was a string of numbers. The numbers were arranged in groups: 41 31558 de Gaza N and 70 was EU 7 forward de W. I recognized them immediately as coordinates. I pulled out my phone and looked them up. They pointed to a location in the Atlantic Ocean, about 150 miles southeast of Nantucket. Deep water, no land, no islands, just ocean. Elias arrived a few minutes later with Juno. They saw the numbers and Elias went pale. "That's where ships report anomalies," he said quietly. "There's a small area of the Atlantic where compasses don't work right, where GPS gets unreliable. It's documented but not well publicized because they can't explain it. Most ships just avoid that section of ocean." We stared at those coordinates, at that impossible message written in frost inside a sealed container, and I think we all knew in that moment that we'd stumbled onto something much bigger and much stranger than we'd imagined. This wasn't just about one port or one section of a container yard. This was about something vast and inexplicable that our facility just happened to be connected to. The frost began to melt as we watched, the numbers running and blurring, becoming illegible. Within minutes, they were gone completely, leaving no trace that they'd ever been there. We documented what we could, took photos, made notes. But I knew even then that this evidence would be dismissed, explained away, forgotten like all the rest. And I was right. The official report classified it as another cargo theft. The coordinates were never mentioned, deemed irrelevant graffiti by the investigating officers. Camera 12 was scheduled for replacement, but the work order got lost in bureaucracy and was never completed. Everything returned to normal, or what passed for normal at our port. But Elias had become obsessed with those coordinates. He started researching maritime incidents in that area, looking for patterns. Juno began tracking shipping routes, trying to find connections between vessels that visited our port and that patch of ocean. And I kept doing my patrols, kept watching the cameras, kept waiting for the next incident that I knew was inevitable. Because whatever was happening in D section, whatever force or phenomenon we'd brushed up against, it wasn't finished. The cycle would continue, playing out in darkness and fog, leaving behind traces of something impossible that no one wanted to acknowledge. We were just witnesses to it, trying to document the undocumentable, to understand the incomprehensible. And deep down, I think we all knew that the more we learned, the less sense any of it would make. The coordinates haunted Elias. In the 2 weeks following their appearance, I watched him transform from a meticulous dock supervisor into something approaching obsession. His desk became covered with maritime charts, printouts from weather databases, and reports of shipping incidents. He'd stopped going home most nights, sleeping in the watchroom between shifts, jerking awake at odd hours to make notes in his increasingly chaotic journals. Juno and I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was difficult. The port had taken on a different character now that we knew what to look for. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more sinister. The routine of checking manifests and monitoring cameras felt like we were performing a ritual without understanding its purpose, going through motions that kept some larger machinery running. On a Thursday night, 2 weeks and 3 days after the coordinates appeared, Elias called us both into the watch room. He had his charts spread out across every available surface, and there was a manic energy to him that made me uncomfortable. "I found something," he said before we'd even taken our coats off. "I found the pattern." He'd been researching shipping records, specifically vessels that had visited our port within the last decade. Then he cross-referenced those with reported incidents in the Atlantic near the coordinates we'd seen. What he found was striking. 7 ships had reported anomalous compass readings or equipment malfunctions in that exact area. All 7 had made port at our facility within a month before their incidents. "It's not just our port either," Elias continued, pulling up more data. I started looking at other harbors along the coast. Portsmouth, Baltimore, Charleston. They all have similar stories if you know how to read between the lines. Documentation errors, camera malfunctions, containers that don't behave the way they should. He showed us incident reports he'd obtained through obscure Freedom of Information requests. The pattern was there once you saw it. Major container ports up and down the eastern seaboard, each with their own problem section, their own unexplained incidents that got written off as technical glitches or clerical errors, and ships that visited these ports frequently reported problems in that same patch of Atlantic Ocean. "It's like that spot in the ocean is, I don't know, broadcasting something," Elias said. "And our ports are receiving it." Juno looked skeptical. "That's a pretty big leap from some shipping incidents and camera problems," she said. But I could see her working through the logic, trying to find flaws in Elias's reasoning. The problem was, when you laid out all the data like he had, the correlation was hard to ignore. Something is connecting these locations, some thread we couldn't quite see. "There's more," Elias said, and pulled out an old newspaper clipping. It was from 1963, a brief article about a fishing vessel that had gone missing near those coordinates. The boat was eventually found, adrift and empty, with its entire crew vanished. The only unusual detail mentioned was that when the Coast Guard boarded it, they found the hold full of water despite there being no apparent breach in the hull. The cargo of fish was gone. He had dozens of similar stories spanning decades, ships that reported strange phenomena near those coordinates, vessels that disappeared or were found abandoned, aircraft that experienced instrument failures when flying over that area. "There's something there," he insisted. "Something in that water that's been active for a long time. And somehow our container yard is connected to it." I thought about the figure we'd seen emerging from the container, its gray skin slick with water that wasn't quite water. The way it had pointed into the fog, trying to communicate something with its ruined throat. Had it been trying to show us something? Trying to warn us? Or was it simply a manifestation of whatever phenomenon Elias was describing? The next scheduled incident, according to Juno's timeline, was set for the following week. This time, we made elaborate preparations. We installed motion sensors in D section, set up thermal cameras to detect temperature anomalies, and even brought in a digital recorder to capture any audio phenomena. Elias wanted to bring in outside help, researchers or scientists who might understand what we were dealing with, but we had no evidence they would accept. Everything we had was circumstantial, easily explained away. The night of the incident, we positioned ourselves strategically around D section. I took the southern approach, Elias the northern, while Juno monitored from the security building with every camera trained on the target area. We maintained radio contact but kept chatter to a minimum. At 2:10 a.m., 5 minutes before the projected time, everything was quiet. The fog had rolled in again, thick and cold. My breath came out in white clouds that hung in the still air. I could hear my heartbeat loud in my ears and the distant sound of water lapping against the pier. The containers around me were dark monoliths, their metal sides beaded with condensation that caught what little light penetrated the fog. At 2:14, my radio crackled. "Camera 12 showing interference," Juno reported, her voice tense, "starting to get snow on the feed." I acknowledged and moved forward slowly, my hand on my weapon. In the distance, I could hear Elias's footsteps, the sound echoing strangely in the fog. We were converging on the center of D section, on the spot where previous incidents had occurred. At exactly 2:15, everything changed. The air pressure shifted, making my ears pop like I'd suddenly gained altitude. The fog seemed to thicken, becoming almost tangible, and the temperature dropped so fast I could see frost forming on the nearest container's surface. My radio died mid-transmission from Juno cutting her voice off with a burst of static. Then I heard it, not the scraping sound from before, but something else. It sounded like water, a lot of water, rushing and churning like a river in flood. But we were surrounded by concrete and steel, nowhere near the ocean's edge. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming from inside the containers around me. I reached the center of D section at the same time Elias did. We both stopped, staring at what we'd found. A container sat in the middle of the yard, door wide open. But instead of darkness inside, there was water. It filled the container completely, pressed against the opening like it was behind glass, defying gravity by not spilling out onto the concrete. The water was moving, churning in slow currents that created patterns I couldn't quite follow. And there were things in the water, shapes, pale and indistinct, drifting in those impossible currents. They might have been debris or kelp or something else entirely. I couldn't tell, and some part of me didn't want to look too closely. Elias started forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said, though I couldn't articulate why. There was something deeply wrong about that water, something that every instinct I had screamed to avoid. He nodded, and we stood there watching the impossible sight before us. One of the shapes in the water drifted closer to the opening. As it approached, details became clearer. It was humanoid, roughly person-sized and shaped, but bloated and distorted by what must have been long submersion. Its skin was pale to the point of translucence, and I could see dark things moving beneath it that might have been veins or might have been something else. The figure's eyes were open but filmed over with a white membrane. Its mouth moved in that same soundless speech I'd seen before, trying to form words it could no longer speak. Then its hand pressed against the barrier of water, fingers spreading, and I saw that the skin between them was webbed. Elias made a small sound beside me, something between a gasp and a sob. The figure in the water seemed to hear him because its head turned, those clouded eyes focusing in our direction. It raised its other hand and began to write on the water's surface from the inside. The movements left trails that glowed faintly, numbers appearing in luminous lines, more coordinates. But these were different from the first set. These pointed to somewhere else, somewhere even further out in the Atlantic. The figure finished writing and then drifted back into the churning depths of that impossible water, disappearing among the other shapes that moved in the darkness. We stood transfixed until the water began to recede. It didn't drain or spill, it simply decreased, the level dropping steadily until the container was empty again. Just bare metal walls. No sign that gallons of ocean had been suspended there moments before. The door swung shut on its own, the seal somehow intact despite never having been cut. My radio sputtered back to life. "Reading you? Hardacre? Truett, what's your status?" Juno's voice was frantic with static. Elias grabbed his radio. "We're here. We're both here. What did you see on the cameras?" There was a pause. "Nothing," Juno said. Camera 12 went down at 2:15 exactly, stayed down for about 90 seconds, then came back up. When it did, you were both just standing there in the middle of the section. What happened? Elias and I looked at each other. What could we tell her? That we'd witnessed water-defying physics? That we'd seen what looked like drowned corpses floating inside a sealed container? That something had written coordinates from beneath an impossible ocean? It sounded insane even in my own head. "False alarm," Elias said into the radio, his voice carefully neutral. "Must have been a sensor glitch. We're heading back." He clipped the radio to his belt and looked at me. "No one can know about this. They'll think we've lost our minds." But I'd already pulled out my phone and photographed the coordinates while they were still visible. The picture showed nothing but an empty container and fog. The glowing numbers didn't appear in the image. I'd expected as much, but the disappointment still hit hard. No evidence, no proof, just our word against the rational explanation that we'd imagined it all. We walked back to the security building in silence. Juno met us at the door, concern written all over her face. "You both look like you've seen a ghost," she said. Elias tried to smile, but it came out wrong, more like a grimace. "Just cold," he said. "Fog gets into your bones." The rest of the shift passed in a blur. We went through the motions of our duties, but my mind was elsewhere, trying to process what I'd witnessed. When day shift finally arrived to relieve us, I was exhausted, but knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Elias looked the same, that manic energy still burning behind his eyes. "We need to find out what those new coordinates point to," he said as we walked to our cars. I'd committed them to memory even though the photograph hadn't captured them. Whatever this is, it's trying to show us something. Maybe if we understand what's at those locations, we can figure out what's happening here. I looked them up when I got home, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee growing cold in my cup. The new coordinates pointed to an area of the Atlantic about 400 miles east of the first location. According to nautical charts, it was even deeper water, a section of ocean floor that dropped away into an underwater canyon. A search for incidents in that area turned up less than I'd hoped. It was further from shipping lanes, less traveled, but there were a few reports, mostly from research vessels. One from 2011 mentioned equipment malfunctions and unusual sonar returns. Another from 2019 described bizarre ocean currents that didn't match any known pattern. Most interesting was a report from a deep-sea survey conducted in 2016. The research vessel had been mapping the ocean floor when their instruments detected what they described as structural anomalies on the canyon wall. The description was vague, carefully worded, but reading between the lines it sounded like they'd found something down there that didn't fit their understanding of natural geological formations. The survey had been cut short due to equipment failures. Multiple instruments had malfunctioned simultaneously, and the ship's navigation systems had experienced what the report called unprecedented interference. They'd left the area and never returned to complete the mapping. I sent the information to Elias's email, knowing he'd be up despite the early hour. His response came back within minutes. "This is it. This is the source." But the source of what exactly? What were we dealing with that could connect deep ocean locations to container yards hundreds of miles away? What force could suspend water in vertical columns or animate drowned figures? Over the next few days, Elias became increasingly convinced that we needed to find a way to visit those coordinates ourselves. "We need to see what's really there," he insisted. "The containers are just, I don't know, windows or doors. The real phenomenon is happening in the ocean." But we were port police, not oceanographers. We had no way to mount a deep-sea expedition, no resources to investigate ocean floor anomalies. The best we could do was watch and document, trying to build a case that someone with more resources might eventually take seriously. The next incident came sooner than expected, only 10 days after the last one. This time, we were ready. All three of us positioned in D section with every piece of recording equipment we could muster. But nothing happened. Camera 12 malfunctioned right on schedule at 2:15 a.m. But no containers opened, no impossible water appeared. Just 90 seconds of dead air. Then everything returned to normal. "It's playing with us," Juno said, and there was real fear in her voice. "It knows we're watching." Elias disagreed. "It's not conscious," he argued. "It's a phenomenon, a natural occurrence we don't understand yet. It's like trying to predict earthquakes or solar flares. There's a pattern, but it's not perfect." I wasn't sure which possibility scared me more. The idea that we were dealing with some kind of intelligence, or that we were witnessing natural phenomena so far outside our understanding that they might as well be supernatural. Either way, we were out of our depth in every sense of the word. The logbook continued to show irregularities. Container numbers would change between entries. Seals that should have shipped out weeks ago would appear on new cargo, and documentation would become corrupted in ways that made investigators think database glitches but never look deeper. It was all connected, all part of something larger than any of us wanted to admit. 2 weeks later, I was doing a routine morning inspection when I found something that made my blood run cold. One of the containers in D section, one that according to records had been sitting empty and unused for months, was leaking. Water was seeping from beneath the door, creating a puddle that spread slowly across the concrete. I called Elias and Juno immediately. By the time they arrived, the puddle had grown to about 6 feet across. It had that same quality as the substance we'd seen before, not quite behaving like normal water. The surface didn't ripple in the wind, and when Elias carefully placed a piece of paper in it, the paper didn't get wet so much as it seemed to dissolve, breaking down into component fibers that drifted in the liquid like plankton. We checked the seal. It was intact, which meant the water was somehow coming from inside a container that was supposedly empty and sealed. Elias made the call to open it, and we brought in a supervisor and customs official to witness. Standard protocol for suspected tampering or damage. When they cut the seal and opened the door, water spilled out. Not a trickle, not a leak, but a flood. Hundreds of gallons of ocean water, complete with seaweed and small marine life, poured from a container that should have been empty. It kept coming for almost a full minute, more volume than the container could possibly hold before finally stopping. We stood there in the spreading pool of salt water surrounded by flopping fish and bits of kelp, while the officials tried to figure out what they were seeing. The rational explanation they settled on was that somehow a water main had broken and flooded the container. Never mind that there were no water mains in that section of the yard. Never mind that the water was clearly from the ocean. Never mind that the volume was impossible. The incident went into the records as infrastructure damage. The container was cleaned and returned to service, and life went on. But Elias knew, Juno knew, and I knew what we'd really witnessed. The ocean was bleeding through somehow, seeping into our world through these containers that served as conduits or portals or whatever you wanted to call them. That night I had a dream. I was standing on the deck of a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The water around me was black and flat, like oil, reflecting nothing. In the distance I could see lights beneath the surface, arranged in patterns that might have been cities or might have been something else entirely. As I watched, containers began rising from the depths. They surfaced slowly, water streaming from their sides, and I could see figures inside them through gaps in the metal, pale figures with webbed hands and clouded eyes, all trying to speak, all reaching toward the surface. And I understood, somehow, that they weren't dead. They were waiting. I woke up drenched in sweat with the smell of salt water in my nostrils. It was just a dream, I told myself. But when I checked my phone, I had a message from Elias sent at 3 a.m. I dreamed about them. The ones in the water, did you? And below that, a message from Juno with the same basic content. Whatever was happening at our port, it was reaching beyond the physical manifestations now. It was getting into our heads, our dreams, pulling us deeper into something we barely understood. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to make it stop, or even if it could be stopped. All I knew was that every night at 2:15 a.m. something happened in D section, and we would be there to witness it, to document it, to try to understand it, because someone had to. Someone had to bear witness to the impossible, even if no one would ever believe us. 3 months after the coordinates first appeared, Elias stopped coming to work. No call, no message, just absence. His apartment stood empty when I went to check on him, mail piling up in the box outside. His car was gone from its usual spot, but no one had seen him leave. It was like he'd simply evaporated into the fog that perpetually hung over the port. Juno and I filed a missing person report, but the investigation went nowhere. The police found no evidence of foul play, no indication of where Elias might have gone. His bank account showed a large cash withdrawal the day before he vanished, and his phone had been turned off shortly after. One detective suggested he'd just decided to leave, start over somewhere else. I didn't believe it. I searched his office after he'd been missing for 2 weeks. The charts and research papers were gone, cleared out methodically. But I found his personal journal wedged behind a filing cabinet where it must have fallen unnoticed. The last entry was dated the night before he disappeared, and it explained everything. I figured it out, he'd written in his precise handwriting. The coordinates aren't just locations. They're depths, layer upon layer descending into the ocean. Each set of numbers leads deeper, further down, and I think there's a bottom, an endpoint where whatever this is originates. I'm going to find it. I've chartered a boat. If I'm right, I'll finally have proof of what we've been seeing. If I'm wrong, well, at least I'll know. He'd included coordinates again, a third set that we'd never witnessed appearing in the containers. These pointed to a spot even further out in the Atlantic, in water so deep that conventional diving was impossible. He'd written notes about specialized equipment, deep-sea submersibles, the name of a research company that rented them to private individuals. He'd been planning this for weeks. I showed the journal to Juno. She read it in silence, her face growing paler with each page. "He went alone," she said finally. "He didn't tell us because he knew we'd try to stop him." She was right, we would have. The idea of diving into deep ocean, based on coordinates provided by something that manifested in our container yard, was insane. But Elias had been past the point of rational decision-making. We tried to track the boat he'd chartered. The company confirmed he'd rented a research vessel for 2 weeks, paid in cash, and departed from a marina in Massachusetts. They'd lost contact with the boat after 4 days. Coast Guard had been notified, but the search had turned up nothing. The ocean had swallowed Elias and his quest for answers. The incidents at the port continued, maintaining their irregular schedule. But now, when I witnessed them, I wondered if somewhere deep in the Atlantic, Elias was seeing the other side. Was he down in those dark waters, discovering the source while we witnessed the effects? The thought should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Camera 12 was finally replaced, the old unit removed and sent to electronics recycling. The new camera worked perfectly for exactly 2 weeks before developing the same interference issues. Juno tried everything. New cables, different frequencies, complete system resets. Nothing helped. At 2:15 a.m. every few weeks, the camera would malfunction for precisely 90 seconds. I started checking the containers in D section during my patrols, looking for signs of the impossible leakage we'd witnessed before. Most nights I found nothing, but occasionally I'd discover evidence. Wet spots that dried into salt crusts, dead fish in places fish had no business being, that distinctive smell of deep ocean that hung in the air like a memory. The logbook irregularities became so common that the port authority just accepted them as a quirk of the system. They hired a digital consultant who blamed old software and promised to fix everything with an upgrade. The upgrade changed nothing. Container numbers still shifted between entries. Seals from shipped cargo still appeared on new containers, and documentation still became corrupted in ways that made no sense. 4 months after Elias disappeared, we got a call from the Coast Guard. They'd found the research vessel he'd chartered, adrift about 600 miles offshore. The boat was intact, engines functional, but completely abandoned. No sign of Elias or the crew he'd hired. The submersible he'd rented was gone, deployed but never recovered. The boat's log ended abruptly mid-entry. Elias had written, "Descending to coordinates, depth approaching 3,000 meters. Sonar shows structure ahead. It's massive. It's..." and nothing more. The rest of the page was blank except for a water stain that had made the paper buckle and warp. Analysis of the stain showed it was salt water, but with properties they couldn't quite explain. Mineral content that didn't match any known ocean composition. I attended the memorial service they held for Elias. His family was there, confused and grieving, asking questions I couldn't answer. How could I tell them he'd disappeared investigating an impossible phenomenon? That he'd gone looking for the source of something that manifested in our container yard and connected to depths of ocean that humans rarely explored? It would sound like the ramblings of someone who'd lost touch with reality. Juno took it hard. She started requesting day shifts, avoiding the night watch when the incidents occurred. I didn't blame her. I'd requested the same if I could have afforded to, but I felt an obligation now, to Elias and to whatever truth he'd been seeking. Someone had to keep watching, keep documenting. Someone had to bear witness. The dreams continued, worse now without Elias around to share them. I'd dream of being underwater, pressure crushing me from all sides, descending toward lights that formed patterns I couldn't comprehend. Sometimes I'd see Elias in these dreams, his skin gone gray and slick, his eyes filmed over, trying to speak through a ruined throat. He'd point downward, always downward, toward depths I couldn't fathom. One night, 6 months after his disappearance, something different happened. It was 2:15 a.m. and I was in D section as usual, camera 12 having just gone dark on schedule. I'd positioned myself near the container that had shown the most frequent anomalies, a unit designated TCLU 4427389 that I'd come to think of as ground zero for the phenomenon. The air pressure shifted as it always did, and the temperature dropped. But this time, instead of a container door opening, I heard my name. Whispered, distant, but unmistakable. Hard Acre. It was Elias's voice. Or something that sounded like Elias's voice filtered through water and distance. I spun around but saw no one. The fog pressed in close, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Then I heard it again, coming from the direction of the container. Hardacre, I found it. The voice was wrong, each word spoken with unnatural pauses between, like the speaker had forgotten how human speech worked. The source, standing now. They're not dead. Never were. Different. Changed. I approached the container slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. The door was closed, seal intact, but I could hear something from inside, a sound like breathing, like the rise and fall of massive lungs. "Elias," I called out, my voice sounding small in the darkness. "Where are you?" "Everywhere," the voice responded, and I realized it wasn't coming from the container at all. It was coming from all around me, from the fog itself. The ocean, the containers, the connection. 3,000 meters down, city, not built, grown. They've been there so long, waiting. The fog swirled in patterns that almost looked deliberate, forming shapes that might have been letters or symbols. I tried to make sense of what I was hearing, what Elias or the thing pretending to be Elias was trying to tell me. "What do you want?" I asked. There was a long pause, filled only with that rhythmic breathing sound. Then, "To show you what I learned. The containers are doors. Open them, all of them, let them through." The voice had taken on a quality that definitely wasn't Elias anymore. It was older, deeper, resonating with harmonics that made my bones ache. "No," I said, backing away from the container. "I don't think so." The fog surged toward me and I felt cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of deep ocean, of pressure and darkness that human bodies weren't meant to endure. "We're not dead," the voice insisted, louder now. "Changed, adapted, better now. You could be too. All of you." I ran. Not proud of it, but I ran back to the security building while that voice called after me, making promises and threats in equal measure. When I burst through the door, gasping for breath, I found Juno at her station staring at the monitors. Camera 12 had come back online. "Did you hear that?" I demanded. She looked at me with concern. "Hear what?" "The cameras were down. I didn't see or hear anything." I grabbed the timestamp and reviewed the footage from the other cameras that covered D section. They showed me standing alone in the fog, talking to no one, then running back to the building. No voice, no swirling patterns in the fog, nothing. But I knew what I'd experienced. Whatever had happened to Elias down in those depths, it had changed him, merged him somehow with the phenomenon we'd been witnessing. And now it was trying to use him, use his voice to manipulate me into doing something that every instinct screamed would be catastrophic. I filed my report, carefully omitting the parts about voices in the fog. Already, I could imagine how it would be received. Stress, overwork, grief over my missing colleague manifesting as auditory hallucinations. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality, spending too many nights in the fog watching for impossible things. But the next morning, I found proof I couldn't dismiss. On the ground in front of the container where I'd heard Elias's voice, someone had written in salt, "Depths Calling." The letters were perfect, precise, formed from crystallized salt that had somehow been arranged on the concrete. By the time I'd retrieved a camera to document it, the morning wind had scattered it beyond recognition. Juno handed in her resignation a week later. "I can't do this anymore," she told me. "Whatever's happening here, it's beyond us. We're not equipped to deal with it, and I don't think anyone is." She'd accepted a position at an inland facility, as far from the ocean as she could get. I wished her well and meant it. She was making the smart choice. I kept working the night shift, now alone in the security building during those pre-dawn hours when the incidents occurred. The Port Authority stopped replacing my partners after 3 different officers requested transfers within their first month. Word had gotten around that D section was a bad assignment. People talked about it in the same tones they used for accident sites or places where someone had died. Haunted, they'd say. That section's haunted. They weren't entirely wrong. Every incident now brought new manifestations. I'd find objects in the containers that couldn't possibly be there, deep-sea creatures that couldn't survive surface pressure, equipment marked with manufacturer names that didn't exist, documents written in languages I didn't recognize. All of it would disappear by the end of my shift, returning to wherever it had come from. The dreams evolved. Now, instead of just descending toward those underwater lights, I'd sometimes reach them. I'd see what Elias must have seen. structures of impossible geometry, grown rather than built, massive and ancient beyond reckoning, and I'd see the inhabitants, if that's what they were. Figures that had once been human but had adapted to the crushing pressure and permanent darkness, changing over generations into something new. They weren't hostile in my dreams, just curious, watching me with those filmed-over eyes trying to communicate with mouths that no longer formed words. They wanted something from us, from the surface world. Not invasion or conquest, connection, understanding, a way back, maybe, or a way forward. The dreams never made it clear. 1 year to the day after Elias disappeared, I received a package at the port office. No return address, no indication of who sent it. Inside was a waterlogged journal and a USB drive. The journal was Elias's, the one he must have taken with him on the research vessel. Most of the pages were destroyed by water damage, but a few entries survived. Day 4. Found it. The structure is beyond anything I imagined. It extends for miles along the canyon wall, grown from the rock itself. Bioluminescent markings that might be writing or might be naturally occurring. I'm going down. Day 5 made contact. They're not what I expected. They were human once. Ship went down here in 1843. Crew survived in air pockets in the wreck. Pressure and isolation changed them, adapted them. They've been here for generations. The last legible entry. They want to come back. Not all the way, they can't survive up there anymore. But the interface, the containers, they can exist partially, between worlds. They just want to be remembered, to be known. I'm going to help them. The USB drive contained video footage from the submersible's cameras. I watched it alone in the security building at 2:15 a.m., the time when the barrier between their world and ours seemed thinnest. The video showed what Elias had described. Massive structures grown into the canyon wall, covered in lights that pulsed in patterns that almost seemed like communication. And I saw them, the changed ones. They moved through the water with an eerie grace, no longer fighting the pressure but part of it. Some still wore remnants of clothing from their previous lives, fragments of 19th century uniforms, bits of chain and brass. They had built a society down there in the crushing dark, evolving and adapting over generations into something that could survive where humans shouldn't be able to exist. The video ended with Elias removing his helmet inside the submersible. His voice, still recognizably his. I understand now. The containers, the manifests, the numbers changing. It's them trying to communicate. They've been trying for decades, leaving traces trying to make us notice. They just want to be acknowledged, to be known. I'm going to stay. Someone has to be the bridge. The screen went dark, and I sat there in the silence of the watchroom, trying to process what I'd seen. Elias hadn't died. He'd chosen to stay, to join them, to become part of whatever they were building in the deep. And the manifestations we'd been witnessing weren't hauntings or invasions. They were communications, reaching up from the depths, trying to establish contact with a world that had forgotten them. I keep the USB drive locked in my desk. I've never shown it to anyone, never filed an official report about it. What would be the point? No one would believe it, and even if they did, what could be done? You can't evict something from the ocean floor. You can't stop a phenomenon that's been occurring for decades, and will probably continue for decades more. So I keep working my shifts, keep watching for the incidents, keep documenting what can't be explained. The containers still shift when no one's looking. Camera 12 still malfunctions at exactly 2:15 a.m. And sometimes, when the fog is especially thick, I hear Elias's voice carried on the wind, telling me about the wonders he's discovered in the depths. I don't answer anymore. I just listen and watch and wait. Because that's all any of us can do when confronted with something too vast, and strange to comprehend. We bear witness. We preserve the memory. We acknowledge that there are depths beneath us, both literal and figurative, that we've only begun to understand. The logbook sits on my desk, filled with its impossible alterations and contradictions. Tomorrow, I'll start a new volume, and it, too, will accumulate its share of unexplainable entries. The containers in D section will continue their subtle movements, continuing their slow conversation with whatever exists in the deep. And I'll be here to watch it happen, night after night, alone in the fog and darkness. Not because I expect to solve the mystery, but because someone has to remember. Someone has to know that beneath the surface of our ordered world, there are other worlds, other possibilities, other ways of being that we've only glimpsed. Elias found his answers in the depths. I'm content to find mine here on the surface, in the space between the ordinary and the impossible, watching the tide of strangeness that flows through our port with every cycle of moon and clock. The ocean keeps its secrets, but sometimes, just sometimes, it shares them with those willing to listen. And I'm listening. I'll keep listening until my shift ends, or until something calls me down to join those who've already made the descent. Until then, I watch, I document, I bear witness. And every night at 2:15 a.m. I stand in D section and wait for the impossible to happen again. My name is Soren Delacroix, and I've worked to port police in this harbor for 8 years. In that time, I've learned that the ocean keeps its own schedule, follows its own rules. Ships come and go with the tide. Fishermen depart before dawn and return at dusk. And everything has a rhythm you can set your watch by. So when something breaks that rhythm, you notice. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when the fishing vessel appeared. I was finishing up my night shift, standing on the main dock, watching the sun break over the eastern horizon. The air was cold enough to make my breath visible, and the water had that slate-gray color it gets right before winter sets in. Gulls were already circling overhead, their cries cutting through the early morning quiet. Isla Corbin was with me, our harbor medic doing her routine check of the first aid stations along the pier. She was a compact woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. Someone who'd seen enough maritime injuries over the years that nothing much fazed her anymore. We were talking about the weather forecast when we both noticed it at the same time. The boat was a commercial fishing vessel, maybe 40 feet long, coming in from the northeast without running lights. That alone was strange enough to make me pay attention. Every vessel in these waters knew the regulations about navigation lights, especially in the pre-dawn darkness. But this boat moved through the water like a ghost, silent and dark. I pulled out my binoculars and got a better look. It was the Persephone, a trawler I recognized from the local fleet. She usually worked the deeper waters about 60 miles out, gone for 3 or 4 days at a time before bringing in her catch. But something about the way she was moving didn't seem right. The engine sound was wrong, too quiet, and she was listing slightly to port. Isla noticed it too. "That's Marcus Vale's boat," she said, lowering her own binoculars. "He went out 5 days ago with a crew of 3. She checked her watch. They weren't due back until tomorrow at the earliest. I grabbed my radio and tried to hail them on the standard channel. "Fishing vessel Persephone, this is Port Police. Please respond with your status." Static crackled back at me, but no voice. I tried again on the emergency frequency with the same result. The boat continued its approach to the harbor, moving at a steady 3 or 4 knots, aimed directly at the commercial fishing dock. There were 4 figures visible on deck, standing motionless near the stern. Through the binoculars I could make out their shapes, but not their faces. They wore the typical gear of fishermen, heavy jackets and rain pants, but they stood too still. No one was at the wheel that I could see. Yet the boat maintained its course with unsettling precision. Isla had already started walking toward the fishing dock, her medical kit slung over her shoulder. I followed, keeping my radio keyed to broadcast. "Persephone, you are approaching the harbor without proper navigation lights. Please respond to confirm you are in control of your vessel." Nothing. Just that steady approach and those motionless figures on deck. The boat glided up to the dock with practiced ease, as if an experienced captain was at the helm. But when I looked through the wheelhouse windows, I couldn't see anyone inside. The wheel turned on its own, making minute corrections, bringing the vessel perfectly parallel to the pier. It was the kind of docking maneuver that took years of experience, yet it happened without any visible human intervention. Mooring lines suddenly flew from the deck, landing precisely where they needed to be on the dock cleats. I watched them move through the air with a sick feeling in my stomach. No one had thrown them. They had simply appeared, snaking out from the boat like they were alive, wrapping themselves around the cleats with perfect seamanship. Isla grabbed one of the lines instinctively, starting to secure it before she realized what she was doing. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Something between confusion and fear. "Soren," she said quietly, "this isn't right." The 4 figures on deck still hadn't moved. Now that the boat was closer, I could see them more clearly. They were definitely human, definitely members of the crew. I recognized Marcus Vale's distinctive orange jacket, saw the other 3 men I knew worked his boat regularly. But they stood with their backs to us, facing out toward the open ocean, completely motionless. I stepped onto the Persephone's deck, my hand resting on my sidearm out of habit more than any real sense of threat. The boat rocked slightly under my weight, but the 4 men didn't react. "Marcus?" I called out. "Marcus Vale, this is Officer Delacroix. I need you to respond." Nothing. I moved closer, close enough now to see that their clothes were soaked through, water dripping steadily from their jackets onto the deck. Their hair was plastered to their heads, and small pools were forming around their boots. It looked like they'd been standing in the rain for hours, except it hadn't rained in 3 days. I reached out and touched Marcus's shoulder. His jacket was ice cold and dripping wet. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I walked around to face him, and what I saw made me take an involuntary step back. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something I couldn't see. His skin had a grayish tinge to it, and his lips were slightly blue, like someone suffering from hypothermia. But what disturbed me most was his expression. It wasn't blank or confused. It was serene, almost peaceful, like he was listening to music only he could hear. Isla had climbed aboard behind me and was checking the other crew members. "They're all the same," she reported, her voice professional but tight with controlled alarm. "Wet, cold, unresponsive. Pupils are reactive, but they won't track movement. Breathing is shallow. Pulse is slow but steady." She pulled out her radio to call for ambulances. I moved toward the wheelhouse, needing to understand how this boat had navigated itself into harbor. The door was unlocked, and when I stepped inside, I found it exactly as it should be. Charts were laid out on the navigation table. The GPS showed their last recorded position from yesterday afternoon, and the radio was set to the correct frequency. Everything was normal except for one detail. The logbook was open on the captain's desk, and the last entry was in Marcus's handwriting. It was dated yesterday at 1400 hours. Schools running deep, following them northeast, good signs. Nothing unusual about that. But underneath, in different handwriting, someone had written a single line. "They're singing now. We have to listen." I stared at that sentence, trying to make sense of it. The handwriting was shakier than Marcus's, less controlled, and it trailed off at the end like the writer had lost strength or interest. I checked the log for earlier entries but found nothing that explained it. Just routine notations about catch rates and weather conditions. The sound of sirens announced the arrival of the ambulances Isla had called. I went back on deck to find her trying unsuccessfully to get responses from the crew. They stood in their positions like statues, water still dripping from their clothes, staring at the horizon with those serene expressions. Paramedics came aboard and started their assessments. They confirmed what Isla had found. All 4 men were alive, breathing, with heartbeats and blood pressure in acceptable ranges. But they showed no response to stimuli, no reaction to questions or physical contact. One of the paramedics described it as being like a catatonic state, except the men's eyes were open and tracking light. As they loaded Marcus onto a stretcher, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. His lips were moving, forming words without sound. I leaned in close and could just barely hear a whisper, so faint it was almost imaginary. He was counting. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, over and over in a rhythmic pattern that matched the gentle rocking of the boat. All 4 men were doing it, each one counting in that same whisper, their lips moving in perfect synchronization. The paramedics didn't seem to notice, too focused on vital signs and medical protocols, but I heard it, and from the look on Isla's face, so did she. They took the crew to the hospital, and I remained on the Persephone to conduct a proper investigation. The boat needed to be searched, documented, and secured. Marek Dolan arrived around 7, our cargo foreman who also handled inspections of fishing vessels. He was a broad-shouldered man with a perpetual sunburn and hands scarred from decades of working with nets and lines. "Heard you had some excitement this morning," he said, climbing aboard. "What's the story with Marcus and his crew?" I filled him in on what we'd found, watching his expression grow more troubled as I talked. He'd known Marcus for 20 years, sailed with him in the old days before taking the foreman job. We started in the hold where the catch would be stored. Marek opened the hatch and we both looked down into the fish hold. It was empty, completely empty. Not just lacking fish, but lacking everything. The ice that should have been there was gone, the storage bins were absent, even the smell that usually permeated fishing boats was missing. It was just a clean, empty space that looked like it had been pressure washed down to bare metal. "That's not possible," Marek said, his voice echoing in the hold. I inspected this boat before they left. It was fully loaded with ice and supplies. There should be tons of equipment down here even if they didn't catch anything. He climbed down the ladder into the hold and I followed. Our boots echoed on the metal floor as we explored the space. There was absolutely nothing, no sign that this hold had ever been used for fishing. The walls were clean, no scales or blood or any of the residue that accumulates in a working vessel. It looked sterile, almost surgical in its cleanliness. Marek ran his hand along the wall and it came away wet. Not damp, but wet, like the metal was sweating. He rubbed his fingers together, testing the consistency. "Salt water," he said. "But there's no leak I can see. No bilge water, no cracks in the hull, just this moisture." We climbed back up to the deck and continued our search. The crew quarters were similarly strange. 4 bunks, all made up neatly, all soaked through like someone had poured water over them. Personal effects were arranged with unnatural precision, everything at perfect right angles. Photographs in waterproof frames showed the crew in happier times, but the glass on each frame was fogged with condensation from the inside. The galley had food in the refrigerator, all of it still fresh and properly stored. Coffee cups sat in the sink, half filled with cold coffee. A pot on the stove contained what looked like the remains of stew, congealed and cold but not moldy. Everything suggested the crew had simply stopped their normal activities mid-action and walked out on deck. I found Marcus's personal cabin last. It was larger than the crew quarters, with a small desk and a bookshelf filled with navigation manuals and paperbacks. His laptop was open on the desk, still powered on somehow, despite being there for days. The screen showed a document, what looked like a personal journal entry. October 18th. Been following the schools for 2 days now. They're moving in patterns I've never seen before, almost like they're being herded by something larger. The men are uneasy, but the catch potential is too good to ignore. Going deeper than usual, but the sonar shows promising returns. October 19th. Found them. Massive school, bigger than anything in 40 years of fishing. But something's wrong. The sonar readings don't make sense. Depths are wrong, shapes are wrong, and there's a sound under the water. You can hear it through the hull, like singing, low and constant. The crew keeps stopping to listen to it. October 20th. We pulled up the nets this morning, nothing. Empty, despite the sonar showing thousands of fish. But the nets were heavy, felt like we'd caught something. When we brought them up, they were full of water, not seawater though, something else. Thick and cold, and it glowed faintly in the darkness. We dumped it back, but I swear some of it stayed on the deck, spreading. The singing is louder now. I can hear it even with the engines running. The entry ended there. I scrolled down, but the rest of the document was blank except for one line at the bottom, written in a larger font. We understand now. Marek had been reading over my shoulder. What the hell does that mean? He asked. I shook my head, having no answer. The laptop suddenly went dark, battery finally dying after days of operation. We stood in the small cabin, listening to the boat creak and settle against the dock. That's when I heard it. Faint and distant, but definitely there. A sound coming from somewhere deep in the boat, below the waterline. It was rhythmic and low, almost like a heartbeat, but not quite. More like breathing, the slow inhalation and exhalation of something massive. Marek heard it too. You check the bilge? He asked. I shook my head. We'd been so focused on the living spaces and hold that we'd skipped the mechanical areas. We made our way to the engine room, following the sound as it grew gradually louder. The engine room was as clean as everything else, which was wrong in itself. Marine engines leaked oil and coolant, left stains and residue. But this space was pristine, almost antiseptic. And it was cold, far colder than it should be. Our breath came out in white puffs as we descended the ladder. The breathing sound was clearer now, definitely coming from the bilge area at the bottom of the boat. Marek grabbed a flashlight and shined it down into the space where water usually collected. There was water there, but it wasn't normal bilge water. It was crystal clear and absolutely still, not sloshing with the boat's movement. And it was deep, far deeper than the bilge should allow. I knelt down and reached toward the water, stopping just before my fingers touched the surface. Something about it made every instinct scream not to make contact. The breathing sound was coming from the water itself, the surface rising and falling in rhythm with it like the water was alive. We need to call this in, Marek said, backing away from the bilge. This is beyond port police jurisdiction. Coast Guard, maybe the Navy. Hell, I don't know who handles this kind of thing. He was right, but I hesitated, trying to figure out what exactly I would report. That a fishing boat returned on its own with a catatonic crew and water that breathes? We left the engine room and returned to the deck. The sun was fully up now, the harbor busy with the normal morning activities. Other fishing boats were preparing to head out. Dock workers were moving cargo containers, and the whole scene looked aggressively normal. The Persephone sat among all this activity like a cancer, wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. I called my supervisor and gave him a sanitized version of what we'd found. He authorized securing the boat as a crime scene and requested that Harbor Patrol keep other vessels away from it. Within an hour, yellow tape surrounded the Persephone, and a small patrol boat maintained position nearby. Isla came by around noon with an update from the hospital. The 4 crew members remained unresponsive, still exhibiting that strange counting behavior. Medical tests showed nothing abnormal in their blood work or brain scans. They were physically healthy but mentally absent, gone somewhere the doctors couldn't reach. One of the nurses said something strange, Isla mentioned as we stood on the dock looking at the Persephone. She said when it's quiet in the room, you can hear the ocean, like waves on a beach, very faint. But they're 60 miles inland. There is no ocean to hear. The rest of the day passed in a bureaucratic haze of reports and phone calls. Coast Guard sent an inspector who looked over the boat and found the same things we had. He took samples of the strange water from the bilge, documented the wet crew quarters, and photographed everything. His report would take weeks to process, he said. In the meantime, the Persephone would remain tied to the dock, sealed as evidence. I finished my shift and went home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sound of my own breathing, and I swear it matched the rhythm I'd heard in the Persephone's bilge. Deep and slow, like the breath of the ocean itself. My phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was Harbor Patrol, their voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Officer Delacroix, you need to get down here. It's the fishing boat. Something's happening." I dressed quickly and drove through empty streets to the harbor. When I arrived, I found Harbor Patrol keeping their distance from the Persephone, their spotlight trained on the vessel from 100 feet away. I could see why they were scared. The boat was moving. Not drifting, not rocking with the waves, but moving in place. The deck was undulating like something was breathing underneath it, the metal flexing in ways metal shouldn't flex, and there was light coming from below deck, a faint blue-green glow that pulsed in rhythm with the movement. Water was pouring from the scuppers, running out of the boat in steady streams. But the boat wasn't sinking. If anything, it seemed to be rising slightly in the water, floating higher than a boat of its size should float. The mooring lines were stretched taut, creaking under strain. I stood on the dock, trying to decide what to do. Procedure said wait for backup, don't approach a potentially dangerous situation alone. But something about that pulsing light compelled me forward. I needed to see what was happening inside that boat. I boarded the Persephone for the second time that day, my flashlight adding to the eerie glow coming from below deck. The movement was more pronounced now that I was on board, the deck rising and falling in that breathing rhythm. I made my way to the engine room hatch and looked down. The bilge was overflowing, that clear water rising up through the grating. But it wasn't spreading naturally. It flowed in patterns, following lines that made no geometric sense, forming shapes on the deck that almost looked like writing. I watched it spread, forming symbols and letters I didn't recognize, then dissolving and reforming into new patterns. The breathing sound had become a voice. Not words, not language, just sound forming into something that resonated in my chest and made my teeth ache. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes almost musical, sometimes grinding and harsh. I realized I was counting along with it, my lips moving in that same unconscious pattern I'd seen in Marcus and his crew. I forced myself to stop, to back away from the hatch. The water had reached my boots now, flowing around my feet but not soaking in. It felt cold and somehow heavier than normal water, like it had substance beyond its physical properties. I retreated to the deck and called for everyone to evacuate the dock. We watched from a safe distance as the Persephone continued its strange transformation. The glow grew brighter, visible now even in the lights of the harbor. The water flowing from the boat formed a pool on the dock, and I could see things moving in it, shapes that might have been fish or might have been something else darting through the shallows too fast to focus on. Around 4 in the morning, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The boat settled back into normal floating position. The glow faded, and the water stopped flowing. By the time the sun came up, the only evidence of the night's events was a damp stain on the dock that was rapidly evaporating. The Coast Guard inspector returned and found nothing wrong. The bilge water was at normal levels, clear of any contamination. The engine room showed no signs of damage or unusual activity. His instruments detected nothing abnormal about the boat's condition. In his official assessment, Harbor Patrol had mistaken normal wave action for something sinister, and the glow we'd seen was likely bioluminescent algae. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew the Persephone wasn't finished with us yet. 3 days after the incident, I was assigned to guard duty on the Persephone during the night shift. The Coast Guard investigation was technically ongoing, but moving at bureaucratic speed, which meant the boat sat at the dock with minimal supervision. My job was to make sure no one tampered with the evidence and to document any unusual activity. Isla volunteered to keep me company, bringing coffee and claiming she wanted to catch up on paperwork in the dock office. I suspected she was as curious as I was about what might happen once darkness fell. We set up in the small harbor master's building that overlooked the fishing dock, with clear sight lines to the Persephone. The boat sat quiet and dark as the sun set. I checked it thoroughly before my shift started, walking through every compartment and finding nothing out of the ordinary. The strange water from the bilge had been pumped out and tested, showing normal salinity and temperature. Whatever had been alive in it was gone now, or hiding so well that laboratory equipment couldn't detect it. Marek stopped by around 8 with sandwiches from the deli up the street. He'd been reassigned to night cargo operations, but made a point of checking on the Persephone each evening. "Feels wrong leaving her tied up like this," he said, looking out at the boat. Marcus kept that vessel in perfect condition, seeing her just sitting there, abandoned. We ate in companionable silence, 3 people trying not to talk about what we'd all witnessed. The harbor was quieter at night, just the sound of water against pilings and the occasional cry of a gull settling in for the evening. Security lights cast pools of yellow illumination across the docks, creating deep shadows between them. Around 10, Isla's radio picked up chatter from the hospital. One of the nurses was calling about Marcus and his crew. The 4 men had suddenly become agitated, all at the same time, straining against their restraints and making sounds for the first time since they'd been admitted. Not words, just that low, rhythmic noise that sounded like the ocean. "They're all doing it together," the nurse reported. "Perfect synchronization, like they rehearsed it. And doctor, I know this sounds crazy, but the water in their IV bags is moving wrong, like it's flowing uphill." Isla grabbed her medical kit immediately. "I'm heading to the hospital," she said. "Call me if anything happens here." She left, and Marek decided to go with her, leaving me alone in the office with a clear view of the Persephone and a growing sense of unease. The boat looked different in the darkness. The security lights didn't reach it well, leaving most of the vessel in shadow. I could see the outline of the wheelhouse, the rigging silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky, but details were lost in the gloom. I kept my flashlight ready and my radio volume turned up. At 11:47, I saw the first footprint. I'd been watching the boat continuously but must have glanced away for a moment to check my phone. When I looked back, there was a wet footprint on the dock between the Persephone and the harbor master's office. Just one, perfectly formed, about 2 feet from the boat. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, approaching the footprint carefully. It was barefoot, human-sized, and absolutely soaked. Water was still pooling in the heel impression, fresh enough that it hadn't started evaporating yet. I looked around for other prints but saw none, just this single mark on the concrete. The Persephone sat quietly at the dock. No movement, no sound. I climbed aboard and did a quick sweep with my flashlight. Every compartment was empty and unchanged from my earlier inspection. The deck was dry except for normal condensation from the night air. No one was aboard. No explanation for that footprint. When I returned to the dock, there was a second print. It was 3 feet further from the boat, heading toward the office. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The prints had appeared while I was on the boat, yet I'd heard nothing, seen nothing, and they were still wet, water actively seeping from them onto the concrete. I keyed my radio. "Harbor Patrol, this is Delacroix at the fishing dock. I need another unit over here now." While I waited for response, a third print appeared. I saw this one form, the water simply manifesting on the concrete in the shape of a foot, like something invisible was walking toward me and leaving these wet traces behind. 4 prints. 5. 6. They were heading directly for the harbor master's office in a steady, purposeful line. I backed away, my hand on my weapon, even though I knew it would be useless against whatever was making these prints. The footsteps were measured and slow, someone walking with deliberate care. Harbor Patrol responded that they were 5 minutes out. I watched the 7th print appear, now only 20 feet from the office door. The wet marks were starting to glow faintly with that same blue-green light I'd seen in the Persephone's bilge. The glow pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat. 8 prints. 9. 10. The line continued straight toward me, and I had to make a choice. I could hold my ground and see what arrived, or I could retreat and maintain distance. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I was port police. This was my jurisdiction, my responsibility. The 11th print appeared at the base of the office steps. I could see water dripping from it, running down the concrete in small rivulets that defied gravity by flowing upward briefly before correcting course. The 12th print was on the first step. Whatever was making them was coming inside. I backed into the office and closed the door, knowing it was futile, but needing the psychological barrier. Through the window, I watched the 13th print appear on the second step, the 14th on the top step. Then, nothing. The footprints stopped at the threshold, the wet impression of toes pointing at the door, like someone standing there waiting to be invited in. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there facing that door, watching the wet outline of feet slowly evaporating in the night air. The glow faded as the water dried, and when Harbor Patrol finally arrived, there was nothing left but faint damp marks that could have been anything. They found me, standing in the office, flashlight still trained on the empty doorway. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but knew how it sounded. Invisible footprints appearing from nowhere, walking from a supposedly empty boat, stopping at my door. The Harbor Patrol officer took notes, but I could see the skepticism in his expression. We searched the area together and found nothing unusual. The Persephone sat at the dock exactly as it should, no sign of disturbance. The concrete where I'd seen the footprints was dry now. Any evidence evaporated. If not for the photos I'd managed to take with my phone, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined it. But the photos showed the wet prints clearly, glowing slightly in the darkness. They showed the progression from boat to office, showed the water pooling in each impression. The Harbor Patrol officer saw them and his skepticism faded into unease. "I'm calling the Coast Guard," he said. "This is beyond port jurisdiction." Isla called around 1 in the morning. "The patients stopped," she reported. Right around midnight, they all went quiet at once. Just stopped the sounds, stopped struggling, went back to that catatonic state. Doctors can't explain it. I asked if anything else had changed, but she said no. They remained exactly as they'd been. Alive, but absent, physically present, but mentally somewhere else. I was relieved from duty at 6, but I couldn't leave yet. I sat in my car, watching the Persephone as the sun came up, trying to understand what I was dealing with. The boat looked so normal in the daylight, just another fishing vessel tied up at the dock, but I knew better now. Something had come off that boat last night, something that left wet footprints and glowed with inner light. Marek found me there around 7. He had coffee and looked like he hadn't slept either. "Isla told me what happened," he said, handing me the cup. "The footprints. You got photos?" I showed him and watched his face go pale. "We need to get that boat out of this harbor," he said quietly, "before something worse happens." But the Coast Guard wasn't ready to move it yet. Their investigation was ongoing. Samples were being analyzed. Reports were being filed. The Persephone would remain at the dock for at least another week, possibly longer. All we could do was watch it and document whatever happened next. I went home and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints forming on the concrete. I dreamed of something rising from deep water, something that had been human once but had changed in ways that made it unrecognizable. It walked across the ocean floor, leaving those same wet tracks, heading toward shore with patient inevitability. When I returned to duty the next night, I found Isla and Marek already at the dock. Neither was scheduled to be there, but both had come anyway. "We're not letting you do this alone," Isla said simply. Marek had brought additional lights and cameras, determined to capture whatever might happen. We set up a more thorough surveillance system with cameras covering every angle of the Persephone and the surrounding dock. Marek positioned motion sensors that would alert us to any movement. Isla had thermal imaging equipment from the Harbor Medical Center, sensitive enough to detect temperature changes from 100 feet away. The boat sat quietly through the early part of the night. We took turns monitoring the equipment while the others tried to rest in the office. Around 11, Marek's motion sensors started pinging. Something was moving on the Persephone's deck. We checked the camera feeds and saw them. Figures, 4 of them, standing on the deck in positions identical to where Marcus and his crew had been when the boat first arrived. They were wet, water streaming from their clothes, and they stood perfectly still facing the ocean. But when we zoomed in, we could see their faces clearly. They were Marcus and his crew, or they looked exactly like Marcus and his crew, down to the clothes they'd been wearing. But these figures couldn't be them because the real crew was still at the hospital, still catatonic. These were something else, copies, or projections, or I didn't know what. Isla grabbed her radio to call it in, but Marek stopped her. "Wait," he said. "Look at the thermal." The imaging equipment showed nothing. The figures standing on the deck didn't register any heat signature at all. They were the same temperature as the ambient air, like they weren't actually there. Yet they were visible on the cameras, clear as day. 4 men standing in water that ran from them in streams, pooling on the deck. As we watched, they turned in unison and faced the dock. Faced us. Their eyes were the same clouded gray I'd seen on Marcus when he first arrived, and their mouths moved in that soundless counting. Then they started walking. They moved across the deck to the gunwale, and without hesitation stepped over the side. I expected to hear splashes as they hit the water, but there was nothing. The camera angle didn't let us see where they went, but motion sensors on the dock started triggering in sequence, tracking movement from the boat toward the office. "There, coming here," Isla said, her voice tight with controlled fear. Marek had his phone out, recording everything. I stood by the door, watching the path from the dock, waiting to see if those figures would appear. The motion sensors continued their pattern, getting closer. Wet footprints started forming on the concrete. Not one set like last night, but 4 distinct trails, all heading our direction. They appeared in steady rhythm, step by step, invisible feet leaving visible evidence of their passage. The water glowed with that blue-green light, brighter than before. The thermal imaging showed nothing. The cameras showed wet footprints but no figures creating them. Our eyes showed empty space between the boat and the office, yet the motion sensors insisted something was there. 4 somethings, walking in formation, approaching our position. I locked the door, knowing it was futile. Whatever was coming had already demonstrated it didn't need conventional means of entry. The footprints reached the office and stopped. 4 sets of wet impressions arranged in a semicircle facing the door. Then they vanished, water evaporating in seconds, leaving no trace. But the lights went out. Every light in the office, every screen, every piece of electronic equipment died simultaneously. Emergency backup systems didn't kick in. We were plunged into darkness so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I heard Isla gasp and Marek curse, then silence. In that silence I heard the ocean. Not the real ocean that lapped at the pilings outside, but a different ocean. Deeper, colder, vaster than anything that should exist in this world. I heard things moving in those depths, huge things with patient intentions. And I heard singing, if you could call it that. The sound I'd read about in Marcus's log, the sound that had drawn them deeper and deeper until they found whatever was waiting there. The lights came back on as suddenly as they'd gone out. We were alone in the office. Everything apparently normal except for the damp patches on the floor where we'd been standing. Our clothes were soaked through like we'd been submerged, and our hair dripped with seawater. But none of us remembered getting wet. Isla checked her watch and made a small sound of confusion. "It's been 40 minutes, she said. "We lost 40 minutes. The last thing I remembered was the lights going out. Now it was nearly 1 in the morning and the time between was just gone, erased from our memory." We checked the camera footage, hoping for some explanation. The recording showed us standing in the office as the footprints approached. The lights went out. For exactly 40 minutes the cameras showed nothing but darkness. Then the lights came back on, and there we were, drenched and confused, exactly as we'd found ourselves. Marek's recording on his phone was the same. 40 minutes of black screen with no audio except that deep ocean sound, distant and all-encompassing. When I listened to it with headphones, I could hear individual voices in the noise. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, all counting in rhythm. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We left the office together, none of us willing to stay there alone. The Persephone sat at the dock looking entirely normal, no glowing water, no mysterious figures. The night was quiet except for normal harbor sounds. But we were different now. We'd lost time, lost memory, and gained the certain knowledge that something from that boat had reached us. Isla drove us all to the hospital. The nurses recognized her and led us into the ward where Marcus and his crew were kept. We needed to see them. Needed to confirm they were still there after seeing those figures on the boat. They were exactly as they'd been, lying in their beds, eyes open but unseeing. But when we entered the room, all 4 of them turned their heads to look at us. They didn't move anything else, just their heads, tracking us as we moved. And their mouths started forming those silent words again, counting in perfect synchronization. One of the monitors started beeping. Marcus's heart rate had changed, not dangerously but noticeably. It had synchronized with his counting, each beat matching a number. The other 3 showed the same pattern. Their hearts were counting, their lips were counting, and in the rhythm I recognized the sound of waves on a shore. We left the hospital as the sun was coming up. None of us spoke on the drive back to the harbor. What could we say? That we'd lost time? That figures matching the catatonic crew had walked from the boat? That something from deep water was reaching into our world through the Persephone? It all sounded insane. But when we arrived at the dock, we found new evidence. The entire deck of the Persephone was covered in wet footprints now, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They overlapped and crossed in complex patterns that almost looked like writing or maps. They were still wet despite hours having passed, water refusing to evaporate. And written in that water, in letters 3 feet tall across the deck, "We are coming home." The Coast Guard sealed the Persephone after we reported the writing on the deck. They brought in a specialized team that wore hazmat suits and carried equipment I didn't recognize. They documented everything, took samples of the water that formed the letters, and tried to determine what they were dealing with. Their instruments showed the water as normal seawater, slightly cold, but within expected parameters. Chemical analysis found nothing unusual, no contaminants or foreign substances. Yet the water remained on the deck, not evaporating, not drying, defying natural laws by its simple persistence. The writing had changed by the time the hazmat team arrived. The letters had reformed into something else, symbols that none of us recognized. They looked almost like navigational charts, marking depths and distances in a notation that predated modern systems. One of the Coast Guard specialists thought they might be ancient maritime notation, possibly centuries old. I was suspended from duty pending psychological evaluation. Standard procedure after reporting impossible events, my supervisor explained with obvious discomfort. Isla and Marek received the same treatment. We were sent to a department psychiatrist who asked careful questions about stress, sleep deprivation, and possible exposure to toxins. I answered honestly, knowing how it would sound. Yes, I saw wet footprints appear from nothing. Yes, I lost 40 minutes with no memory of what happened. Yes, I believed something from deep water was trying to reach the surface through the Persephone. The psychiatrist made notes and suggested a minimum 2-week leave to recover. But I couldn't leave it alone. On my own time, I started researching maritime history in the area. I wanted to know if anything like this had happened before, if there were precedents for fishing vessels returning with catatonic crews and water that didn't obey physics. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. Every 20 to 30 years for the past century and a half, there had been incidents. Boats returning with confused or absent crews, fishermen reporting strange sounds underwater, areas of ocean where instruments malfunctioned and crews became disoriented. The details varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. Most incidents were written off as accidents, equipment failures, or the hazards of working at sea. But when I plotted them on a chart, they all clustered in the same general area. About 60 miles northeast of the harbor, in a section of ocean that old charts marked with a simple notation, troubled waters, avoid if possible. I showed my research to Ila and Marek. We met at a coffee shop far from the harbor, 3 people on involuntary leave trying to make sense of impossible events. Ila had done her own research into the medical cases, pulling records from old hospital archives with the excuse of studying historical treatment protocols. She'd found them. Fishermen admitted over the decades with the same symptoms Marcus and his crew displayed. Catatonic but alive. Heartbeats synchronized to unknown rhythms, counting silently. Most eventually recovered, but none could remember what happened to them. They'd describe going out to fish, and then waking up in the hospital with days or weeks missing. A few never recovered. They remained in that absent state until they died, usually within a year. Their bodies would function normally, eating and sleeping on automatic response, but the person inside was gone. Medical examiners attributed it to strokes or brain damage from unknown trauma, but Ila had found patterns in their final days. They'd all started speaking again just before the end. Not coherent speech, just fragments. Words in languages they shouldn't know, describing things that existed only in deep ocean. Pressures that would crush a human body. Darkness that had weight and texture. Songs that resonated through water for hundreds of miles. Marek had been investigating the Persephone's history. The boat was 40 years old, built in a local yard, and owned by 3 different captains before Marcus bought it 15 years ago. 2 of those previous owners had experienced similar incidents to what we'd witnessed. In 1989, Captain Edward Voss had brought the Persephone back to harbor with his entire crew, suffering from hypothermia despite it being August. They'd been found on deck, soaking wet, unable to explain how they'd gotten that way. Voss sold the boat within a month and moved inland, never fishing again. In 2003, Captain Sarah Miniola reported hearing voices coming from the Persephone's radio at night. Voices counting in languages she didn't recognize, broadcasting on frequencies that shouldn't exist. She'd documented it extensively before the Coast Guard confiscated her radio logs. She died 6 months later in a diving accident, recovered from water much deeper than where she should have been diving. The boat's not the source, Marek concluded. It's a receiver. Something out there is broadcasting and the Persephone picks it up stronger than other vessels. Maybe because of how it's built, maybe because of where it's sailed. But it's connected to whatever's in that patch of ocean. We sat with that knowledge, trying to decide what to do with it. We had no evidence anyone would accept, no way to prove what we'd experienced. The psychiatrist would see any further investigation as obsession, proof we needed more than 2 weeks off. Our careers were probably already damaged beyond repair. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, and I swear I could hear counting. Faint and distant, like it was coming through the walls. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I got up and went to the window, looking out at the city lights. My phone rang. It was the hospital, a nurse I didn't recognize. "Officer Delacroix, you're listed as a contact for the fishermen we have in care. There's been a development." I asked what happened, but she insisted I needed to come see for myself. I called Ela and Marek on the drive over. Both had received the same call. Both were already en route. We arrived at the hospital within minutes of each other and were escorted to the ward where Marcus and his crew were kept. The hallway outside their rooms was full of staff, doctors, and nurses crowding around monitors and talking in urgent tones. The 4 men were sitting up in their beds, the first significant movement they'd made since being admitted. They were still counting, but now their voices were audible, speaking in that same synchronized rhythm. And they were looking at something. All 4 focused on the same point in empty space as if watching something only they could see. A doctor approached us with a tablet showing brain scans. "They've had a massive increase in neural activity," he explained, "across all areas of the brain simultaneously. It's like they suddenly woke up, except they're not actually conscious. It's more like they're dreaming, but with their eyes open." I looked at Marcus, and our eyes met. For just a moment, I thought I saw recognition there, a flash of the man I'd known. His mouth kept counting, but his eyes held mine, and I had the uncanny feeling he was trying to tell me something. Then all 4 men spoke in unison, their voices blending into one. Not counting this time, but actual words. "The tide is rising. 7 days, they're coming home." The monitors went crazy. Heart rates spiked, blood pressure dropped, oxygen levels fluctuated wildly. Medical staff rushed in with equipment and medications while we were ushered out of the room. Through the window, I watched them work to stabilize the patients. Saw Marcus's mouth still moving in that familiar counting pattern, even as they intubated him. We stood in the hallway while organized chaos played out inside. A doctor came out after 20 minutes to tell us they'd stabilized all four, but the prognosis wasn't good. The strain on their systems was immense and unexplainable. If they had another episode like this, their bodies might not survive it. What did they mean? Isla asked. 7 days until what? I knew, but didn't want to say it out loud. 7 days until something emerged from the ocean. Something that had been calling to the Persephone and its crew. Something that considered the surface world home and was finally ready to return. We returned to the harbor despite being officially barred from the premises. I still had my access badge and the night guard recognized us, waving us through with a warning to be careful. The Persephone sat at the dock, surrounded by barriers and warning signs, officially quarantined by the Coast Guard. The hazmat team had left for the night, but their equipment remained. Sensors and cameras covered every angle, monitoring the boat for changes. I accessed the feed from the harbor master's office computer and saw what they were seeing. The water writing on the deck had changed again, now showing what looked like a calendar or countdown. 7 symbols, the first already faded. "It's marking days," Marek said, pointing at the screen. "One symbol disappears every 24 hours. When they're all gone..." He didn't finish the sentence. When they were all gone, whatever was coming would arrive. Isla pulled up maritime weather data on her phone. "There's a storm forming," she said. "Big one, coming in from the northeast. Unusual for this time of year. They're predicting it'll hit in 7 days." The pieces were connecting in ways I didn't like. A storm from the direction of those troubled waters, arriving exactly when the countdown completed. Marcus and his crew speaking of a rising tide. The writing on the Persephone's deck counting down to something. I remembered the logbook entry about nets full of water instead of fish. Water that glowed and spread. I thought about the footprints that walked from the boat. The figures that appeared on deck looking like the crew but registering no heat signature. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Something was using the water itself as a medium, spreading through it, preparing to manifest. "We need to get that boat out of the harbor," I said. "Tow it back out to sea, sink it if we have to. Whatever's coming, we can't let it arrive here where there are people." But it was after midnight on a Saturday. No one with authority to make that decision would be available until Monday at the earliest. By then, 2 more days would have passed on the countdown. We'd be more than halfway to whatever was coming. Marek had a different idea. "The radio," he said. Marcus's log mentioned voices on the radio. What if we could intercept them, figure out what they're saying? It was a long shot, but better than waiting helplessly. We went aboard the Persephone, bypassing the Coast Guard barriers with my override codes. The boat felt different now, colder than the night air could account for. Our breath came out in white puffs, and the metal surfaces were covered in a thin layer of frost. The radio in the wheelhouse was still powered on, Coast Guard having left it active to monitor any transmissions. It was tuned to Channel 16, the international distress frequency. Nothing but static came through the speaker, but Marek started cycling through other channels. Most were empty, some carried normal maritime traffic. Then he hit Channel 28 and we all froze. A voice was broadcasting. Not words, just that counting we'd heard so many times. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It went on without pause, without variation. The numbers repeating in an endless loop. But underneath it, if you listened carefully, there were other sounds. Movement through water, rhythmic and vast. Things breathing in the depths. Isla pulled out her phone and started recording. We listened for almost an hour as the broadcast continued unchanged. Always the same numbers, the same rhythm. Then, at exactly 2 in the morning, it stopped. Silence filled the speaker for 10 seconds. Then a new voice began. This one was speaking English, clear and precise. Coordinates 40.2 degrees north, 70.6 degrees west. Depth 600 fathoms. Rising at 2 fathoms per hour. Arrival scheduled for November 1st, 0300 hours. All vessels must vacate area. It was today's date. November 1st was 7 days away, and those coordinates put whatever was rising directly between the harbor and that patch of troubled ocean. It was coming up from the depths, ascending at a steady rate, on course to reach the surface exactly when the countdown on the Persephone's deck reached 0. We had 7 days to figure out what was coming and how to stop it. 7 days before something that had lived in crushing pressure and absolute darkness reached shallow water. 7 days before it came home to a surface it might not have seen in decades or centuries or longer. The radio went silent again. I tried transmitting on the same channel, asking who was broadcasting and what their intentions were. No response came, just static, empty and waiting. We left the Persephone and returned to the office. I filed an emergency report with the Coast Guard, including the radio transmission and our analysis of what it meant. They acknowledged receipt, but I knew it would get buried in bureaucracy. A report from suspended officers about mysterious radio broadcasts and rising threats from the deep wouldn't be taken seriously. The next morning, I went to see my supervisor against the psychiatrist's orders. I laid out everything we'd learned, showed him the evidence, played him the radio transmission. He listened with growing discomfort, clearly torn between dismissing it as stress-induced delusion and taking the threat seriously. "Even if I believed you," he finally said, "what am I supposed to do? Call the Navy and tell them something's rising from the ocean floor? Evacuate the harbor because of a radio broadcast? I'd lose my job and you'd be committed for psychiatric evaluation." He was right, but that didn't change what was coming. I left his office knowing we were on our own. The authorities wouldn't act without concrete proof, and by the time we had that proof, it would be too late. Isla, Marek, and I spent the next 2 days planning. If the official channels wouldn't help, we'd handle it ourselves. Marek knew boat captains who owed him favors, people who'd help without asking too many questions. Isla had connections at the Marine Research Institute, access to equipment that might be useful. We assembled a motley crew of helpers, people who'd seen enough strange things at sea to believe our story might have merit. A salvage captain who'd once pulled a boat from deep water with every clock aboard stopped at the same time. A marine biologist who'd observed fish behavior that defied explanation. A retired Coast Guard officer who'd investigated too many disappearances in those troubled waters. Our plan was simple if desperate. On the night of November 1st, we'd be at those coordinates with enough equipment to document whatever surfaced. If it was hostile, we'd try to drive it back down. If it was something else, we'd try to communicate. Either way, we'd be there when it arrived. 6 days to go. The symbol on the Persephone's deck continued to fade on schedule. Marcus and his crew remained stable but catatonic, their counting now synchronized with the radio broadcasts we monitored every night at 2 in the morning. The storm continued building offshore, growing stronger than meteorologists had predicted. And in the depths, something rose at exactly 2 fathoms per hour, ascending from pressures that would crush steel, heading toward air and light it might not have experienced in generations. We were running out of time to stop it. Day 6. The storm was close enough now that we could see it on the horizon, a dark line of clouds building where sky met ocean. The waves had changed, long swells rolling in from the northeast with a rhythm that felt wrong. Too regular, too precise, like they were being generated by something mechanical rather than wind and tide. I stood on the dock watching the Persephone rock with those swells. 2 symbols remained on its deck, fading slowly. The Coast Guard had given up trying to clean them off after the water reformed itself every time they removed it. Now they just monitored the boat from a distance, documenting but not interfering. Marek had assembled our expedition team, 8 of us total, taking 2 boats out to the coordinates where the broadcasts originated. We'd leave at midnight, time our arrival for 3 in the morning when whatever was rising reached the surface. Isla had loaded 1 boat with medical equipment and the other with electronics, sonar, underwater cameras, radio gear that could receive on frequencies conventional equipment missed. My supervisor had gotten wind of our plans and tried to stop us. He couldn't officially prevent civilian boats from launching, but he made it clear that if anything went wrong, we were on our own. No Coast Guard backup, no official support, just us and whatever we found in the troubled waters. The hospital called that evening. Marcus and his crew had become agitated again, fighting restraints, counting loud enough to be heard throughout the ward. The doctors wanted to sedate them, but something about their vital signs made them hesitate. The men's bodies were changing, adapting to something. Their lung capacity had increased, their blood oxygen levels were abnormally high, and their core temperatures had dropped to levels that should have been fatal, but somehow weren't. "They're preparing," Isla said when she relayed the news. "Their bodies are getting ready for something. Like they know what's coming and they're adapting to meet it." I thought about those old cases she'd found. The fishermen who never recovered, who'd eventually died still counting. Maybe they hadn't died. Maybe they'd transformed, changed into something that could survive where humans couldn't. And maybe that's what Marcus and his crew were becoming. The retired Coast Guard officer, a man named Heller, who'd agreed to join our expedition, brought charts to our final planning meeting. He'd marked every disappearance, every strange incident in the troubled waters going back 50 years. "There's a pattern," he said, spreading the charts across the table. "Every time it happens, there's a storm, and every storm is exactly 7 days from something else." He showed us the progression. 7 days before a storm, fishermen would report unusual catches. 7 days before that, instruments would start malfunctioning in the area. 7 days before that, strange sounds would be heard underwater. The cycle repeated every few years, but we'd never noticed because each event was documented separately, never connected. "It's a schedule," Heller continued. "Whatever lives down there operates on a timeline we barely understand. It sends signals, changes the water, prepares the way, and every so often it rises close enough to the surface that we notice. But it's always been down there, always active, always following this pattern." Marek pulled up sonar data from research vessels that had passed through the area. Deep scans showed something massive on the ocean floor, something that registered as metallic but with organic properties. It covered several square miles and had depth that exceeded the scanning equipment's range. Most researchers assumed it was a geological formation, maybe volcanic, but the scans from different years showed changes, growth, movement that geology couldn't explain. "I think it's a city," Marek said quietly. "Or what used to be a city. Something that sank a long time ago and adapted to the depths. Whatever lived there didn't die, it changed, and now it wants to come back." The idea should have been ridiculous, but after everything we'd seen, it made terrible sense. The footprints walking from the Persephone, the figures that looked like Marcus's crew but weren't, they were scouts, projections sent ahead to test the surface to see if return was possible. And the countdown meant the main event was about to happen. We loaded the boats as the sun set on November 1st. Medical supplies, documentation equipment, emergency gear. Isla had brought samples of the water from the Persephone, thinking maybe we could analyze it, compare it to what we found at the coordinates. Marek loaded flares and emergency beacons in case we needed to call for help. Heller took the helm of the lead boat, a sturdy research vessel he'd borrowed from the Marine Institute. I piloted the second boat, a fishing trawler owned by one of Marek's contacts. Between us, we had enough firepower to handle anything conventional, but I suspected bullets would be useless against what we were facing. We departed at midnight with the storm building behind us. The waves were 8 feet now and rising, making for rough sailing even with experienced crews. The boats rose and fell with the swells, engines straining against the water. Above us, clouds blocked out the stars and the wind carried a smell like ozone mixed with salt and something older, something that had been buried under pressure for longer than our civilization had existed. The radio crackled with the nightly broadcast right on schedule at 2 in the morning. Still counting, still marking rhythm. But now there was urgency to it, the numbers coming faster. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, racing toward some conclusion. We reached the coordinates at 2:47 a.m., 13 minutes ahead of schedule. Heller's sonar showed the ocean floor 600 fathoms down, exactly as the broadcast had reported. But something was rising from those depths, a massive contact moving upward at steady speed. 2 fathoms per hour it had been climbing. Now it was accelerating. "It knows we're here," Heller said, studying the sonar returns. "It's moving faster, like it's excited or anticipating something." The contact was huge, larger than both our boats combined, and it was ascending directly beneath us. Isla had the underwater cameras deployed, high-definition lenses pointed down into the dark water. The screens showed nothing but blackness at first. Then, far below, lights began to appear. Blue-green bioluminescence, the same glow we'd seen in the Persephone. But this was on a massive scale, illuminating something so large the cameras couldn't capture it all at once. It looked like a city, towers and structures covered in living light, grown from the ocean floor in defiance of pressure that should have crushed anything artificial. Buildings, if you could call them that, more like coral formations shaped by intelligence into purposeful architecture. And, moving among them, figures. Hundreds of figures, thousands, all streaming upward following the rising structure. "They're not dead," Isla whispered, watching the screen. "They adapted. Generations of them living down there, building and changing and waiting, and now they're coming home." The sonar showed the main structure still 200 fathoms down, but rising faster now. 4 fathoms per hour. 6, 8. It would breach the surface in less than 30 minutes. The figures moving around it were ascending even faster, swimming through the water with inhuman grace. Marek grabbed the radio and broadcast on all channels. "Any vessels in the area, this is an emergency. Clear the coordinates 41.2 degree north, 70.6 degree west immediately. Repeat, evacuate the area now." He didn't explain why, just kept broadcasting the warning. A few boats responded, commercial fishing vessels working the night shift. They asked what the emergency was, but Marek just repeated the warning. One captain said he'd comply. Another said he was already heading in because his instruments were going crazy. A third didn't respond at all. The storm reached us at 2:58. Rain began falling in sheets, wind pushing waves to 15 feet. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the churning water in brief, stark flashes. In those flashes, I saw them surfacing around our boats. The figures from the depths, breaking the surface, their faces turning up toward air they hadn't breathed in decades or centuries. They looked human enough. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but wrong in subtle ways that made them alien, skin that was too pale, almost translucent. Eyes that had adapted to darkness, large and reflective. mouths that opened too wide, revealing structures that had evolved for breathing water as easily as air. They didn't attack, just surfaced and watched us, hundreds of them now forming a circle around our vessels. At 3:00 a.m. exactly, the main structure broke the surface. It rose from the water like an island being born, shedding ocean and waterfalls that caught the lightning and glowed. Architecture that mixed ancient human construction with organic growth, covered in life that had adapted to crushing pressure and permanent darkness. It was beautiful and terrible, defying every law of physics by its simple existence. The structure kept rising, higher and higher, until it stood 40 feet above the waves. And standing on its highest point, looking toward the shore, was a figure I recognized. Marcus Vale, or what Marcus had become. His body had changed, adapted like the others, but his face was unmistakable. He raised his hand, and the counting stopped. All of it, the radio broadcast, the figures in the water, everything went silent. Then he spoke, and his voice carried across the water despite the storm. "We have returned." That's when the Persephone's radio crackled to life back at the harbor. I could hear it through our connection to shore, the harbor master monitoring our expedition. The boat was broadcasting now, its radio active despite being unmanned and unpowered. Marcus's voice came through, speaking from both the risen structure and the boat simultaneously. "We were fishermen once. We were explorers, sailors, people of the surface world. The ocean took us, storms and accidents and the hazards of the sea. But we didn't die. We changed. We adapted. We built something new in the crushing dark." The figures in the water had begun swimming toward shore. Hundreds of them streaming past our boats. We couldn't stop them, didn't know how to try. They moved with purpose, heading for the harbor, for the Persephone that had been calling them. "We want to come home," Marcus continued, "not to reclaim what we lost, but to bridge what we've become with what we were. The Persephone was our beacon, the last connection to the surface, and now we're strong enough to answer its call. Isla was trying to raise the Coast Guard, but the storm was interfering with communications. Marek had started the engine, preparing to follow the swimming figures back to harbor. Heller stood at his helm with an expression I couldn't read. Decades of maritime experience failing to provide context for what we were witnessing. I grabbed the radio and spoke directly to Marcus. "If you go to shore, they'll fight you. The military, the government, they won't accept what you've become." My voice was almost lost in the storm, but he heard me. His eyes found our boat despite the distance and darkness. "We know," he said, "but we're not asking permission. We're not invading. We're just coming home to die." The words hit me like a physical blow. Coming home to die. The structure was already sinking back beneath the waves, descending as fast as it had risen. The figures in the water were slowing, their movements becoming labored. Around our boats, some were floating now instead of swimming, their adapted bodies failing in the surface pressure and oxygen-rich air. "We can't survive up here," Marcus said, his voice fading. "The pressure is too low, the air too thin for what we've become. But we needed to see it one last time, needed to remember what we were before we let go completely." The structure vanished beneath the waves, taking Marcus with it. The figures in the water were dying now, their bodies shutting down one by one. They floated on the surface, eyes still open, mouths still counting silently as their hearts stopped. Within minutes, hundreds of them were dead, casualties of a pressure change their adapted bodies couldn't handle. We pulled several from the water, trying to save them, but they died in our hands. Isla performed CPR on one, a woman who might have been 60 or 16 or any age in between. Her skin was already changing color, the pale gray fading to something more human as her body returned to what it had been. She stopped counting at 19 and didn't start again. By the time we reached the harbor at dawn, it was over. The swimming figures had all died before reaching shore, their bodies floating in a line that stretched from the troubled waters to the harbor mouth. Coast Guard vessels were already recovering them, marking positions, trying to understand what had happened. The Persephone sat at its dock unchanged. The symbols on its deck had vanished completely, leaving clean metal. The radio had gone silent. The boat was just a boat again, no longer a beacon, no longer connected to anything in the depths. Marcus and his original crew remained in the hospital, but their conditions had changed. They were conscious now, aware, able to speak. They remembered everything. Going out to fish, finding the anomaly, being pulled into something vast and old that had been waiting. They remembered changing, adapting, becoming part of something that existed between the surface world and the depths. "It's still down there," Marcus told me when I visited him a week later. "The city, the others who chose to stay. They'll keep living in the dark, keep adapting, keep building. But we're done. We tried to come back and it killed us. Not the city, not the others, just the simple incompatibility of what we'd become with where we started." 3 of the original crew survived. One died during the transition back, his body unable to readjust to surface pressure. The dead from the rising were never fully identified. Some had been missing for decades, lost to storms and accidents that were recorded in maritime archives. Others were older, possibly centuries old, their origins lost to time. The Coast Guard classified it as a mass drowning event, bodies that had been preserved in deep, cold water suddenly rising to the surface. Plausible deniability for something they couldn't explain. The story made national news for a day, then vanished. Too strange to persist, too uncomfortable to examine closely. I returned to duty after my psychiatric evaluation. They'd witnessed enough physical evidence from the rising that my reports were reluctantly accepted as accurate. Isla and Marek came back too, all of us changed by what we'd seen, but unable to talk about it except with each other. The Persephone was sold at auction, bought by a fishing company that didn't know its history. It goes out regularly now, works the normal fishing grounds, brings back normal catches. No strange radio broadcasts, no counting, no mysterious water. Whatever connection it had to the depths was severed when the city rose and fell. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the fog rolls in, I stand at the harbor and listen to the water, and I swear I can still hear them counting, down in the depths where pressure crushes and darkness is absolute. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Marking time in a place where time moves differently, where human adaptations have created something neither fully human nor entirely other. They're still there, still building, still waiting. Maybe someday they'll rise again, stronger this time, able to survive in our air and pressure. Or maybe they'll stay in the dark forever, content with what they've become. Either way, I'll be here watching, because someone has to remember what came up from the depths. Someone has to bear witness to the impossible, to the beautiful and terrible truth that the ocean keeps its own, and what it takes, it changes into something new. The Persephone doesn't call to them anymore. But I think they remember us, the way Marcus remembered enough to try coming home one last time. And maybe that's enough. Maybe memory is the bridge between what we are and what we might become. Given enough pressure, enough time, enough darkness to change in. I keep my radio tuned to channel 28 sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come. Mostly, it's just static. But occasionally, very faintly, I hear counting. And I count along, keeping rhythm with something vast and patient that lives where light doesn't reach. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. The numbers go on forever in the depths.